No longer human. Osamu Dazai. Preface. I have seen 3 photographs of the man. The first, presumably from his childhood, perhaps around the age of 10, shows him surrounded by a large number of women, presumably his sisters, and perhaps female cousins. He stands by the edge of a garden pond, wearing a striped hakama, his head tilted about 30 degrees to the left, smiling an ugly smile. Ugly? Yet those insensitive to such things, those unconcerned with beauty and ugliness, might offer a perfunctory compliment, saying with an indifferent expression, "What a cute little boy," and not be entirely off the mark. A hint of conventional cuteness does flicker in the child's smile. But anyone with the slightest sensitivity to aesthetics would, upon seeing it, mutter with marked displeasure, "What a repulsive child," and might toss the photograph aside as if brushing away a caterpillar. Indeed, the more one scrutinizes the child's smile, the more disturbingly eerie it becomes. It isn't a smile at all. The boy isn't smiling in the least. Proof of this lies in his tightly clenched fists. Humans cannot smile with their fists clenched. It's an ape. An ape's grin. He's simply contorting his face into an ugly grimace. It's a bizarre expression, as if one wanted to call him Master Grimace, somehow irritating, strangely provocative. I had never before seen a child with such a peculiar expression. The face in the second photograph had undergone a startling transformation. He was a student now. Whether in high school or college is unclear, but in any case, he was an astonishingly handsome young man. Yet again, strangely, he didn't seem like a living human being. Dressed in a student uniform, a white handkerchief peeking from his breast pocket, he sat in a wicker chair with his legs crossed, and, again, he was smiling. This smile, unlike the grimacing ape's grin, was a rather skillful, practiced smile. Still, it was somehow different from a human smile. It lacked a certain weight, a vitality, a sense of substance. It was light, not bird-like, but feather-light, as if he were nothing but a blank sheet of paper, and he was smiling. In short, he felt utterly artificial. To call it affected doesn't suffice. To call it frivolous doesn't suffice. To call it a smirk doesn't suffice. To call it stylish certainly doesn't suffice. And yet, upon closer inspection, even this handsome student exuded a certain ghost story eeriness. I had never before seen a young man with such a strange handsomeness. The third photograph was the most unsettling. It was impossible to tell his age. His hair appeared somewhat grey. He was huddled in the corner of a squalid room. The photograph clearly showed 3 places where the wall had crumbled, warming his hands over a small brazier, and this time, he wasn't smiling. He had no expression whatsoever. It was a truly ghastly picture, reeking of ill omen, as if he were simply sitting there, warming his hands, and naturally dying. The strangeness didn't end there. Because his face was relatively large in the photograph, I could examine its structure closely. His forehead was ordinary, his forehead wrinkles ordinary, his eyebrows ordinary, his eyes ordinary, his nose, mouth, chin. This face not only lacked expression, it lacked even an impression. It had no distinguishing features. For instance, if I looked at the photograph and then closed my eyes, I had already forgotten his face. I could recall the crumbling wall, the small brazier, but the impression of the face of the room's occupant vanished like mist, utterly, completely irretrievable. It was a face that couldn't be painted. It was a face that couldn't even be caricatured. I opened my eyes. Ah, so that's what his face was like, I remembered, but I felt no such joy of recognition. To put it bluntly, even when I opened my eyes and looked at the photograph again, I couldn't remember. And it was simply unpleasant, irritating, a face I wanted to turn away from. Even a so-called death mask would have some expression, some impression. Perhaps this is what a human body would look like with a horse's head attached. In any case, it gave the viewer a shudder, a feeling of unease, without any specific reason. I had never before seen the face of such a strange man. Page break. Notebook 1. Mine has been a life of much shame. I can't even grasp what it means to live like a human being. I was born in the countryside of Tohoku, and didn't see a train until I was quite grown. I used to go up and down the pedestrian bridge at the train station without ever realizing that it was built to cross the tracks. I assumed it was there simply to make the station grounds more complicated and enjoyable, like some sort of foreign amusement park, a touch of modern elegance. And I thought this for quite a long time. Going up and down the bridge was, for me, a rather sophisticated amusement, one of the most thoughtful services offered by the railroad. Later, when I discovered that it was merely a very practical staircase for passengers to cross the tracks, I suddenly lost interest. Similarly, as a child, when I saw pictures of subways in books, I didn't think they were devised out of practical necessity. I thought it must be more fun and novel to ride in an underground car than a car above ground, a pleasant diversion. I was a sickly child and often confined to bed. Lying there, I would gaze at the sheets, the pillowcase, the quilt cover, and think what pointless decorations they were. I didn't realize until I was almost 20 that they were actually practical items. The realization of human practicality filled me with gloom and sadness. I also never understood what it meant to be hungry. No, this doesn't mean I grew up in a home where we lacked food and shelter. Don't be ridiculous. It means I simply couldn't comprehend the sensation of hunger. It's a strange way to put it, but even when my stomach was empty, I didn't realize it. When I came home from elementary school or middle school, everyone around me would fuss, saying, "You must be hungry. We know how it is. Coming home from school, you're absolutely ravenous. How about some sugared beans? We have sponge cake and bread too." So, displaying my usual tendency to ingratiate myself, I'd murmur, "I'm hungry," and pop 10 or so sugared beans into my mouth, but I had no idea what the feeling of hunger was actually like. Of course, I ate plenty of food. But I have almost no memory of ever eating because I felt hungry. I ate things that seemed unusual. I ate things that seemed luxurious. And when I was offered food at someone else's house, I generally ate it, even if I had to force it down. In fact, the most agonizing time of day for me as a child was mealtime at home. In my rural home, the 10 or so members of our family would sit facing each other in 2 rows, their individual trays laid out before them. As the youngest, I naturally sat at the very bottom of the hierarchy. The dining room was dimly lit, and during lunch, for example, the sight of 10-odd family members silently eating their meals always chilled me to the bone. It was an old-fashioned, rural household, so the dishes were usually the same. There were no unusual or luxurious foods to look forward to, and I came to dread mealtimes. I would sit at the end of the table in that gloomy room, shivering as if with cold, lifting small portions of rice to my mouth and forcing them down. Why, I wondered, did humans eat rice 3 times a day? Everyone ate with such solemn expressions. Perhaps it was a kind of ritual, I thought, the family gathering 3 times a day at fixed hours in a dimly lit room, arranging their trays in proper order, chewing their rice in silence, heads bowed, praying to the spirits that dwelled within the house. The saying, "If you don't eat, you'll die," sounded to me like nothing more than an unpleasant threat. That superstition, even now, it somehow feels like a superstition to me, always filled me with anxiety and dread. There was no phrase more perplexing, more obscure, more menacing than the one that claimed humans worked so they could eat, and if they didn't eat, they would die. In other words, it seems I still don't understand anything about human endeavors. A sense of unease, stemming from the utter disconnect between my notion of happiness and the notion of happiness held by everyone else in the world, this unease has kept me tossing and turning night after night, groaning, sometimes even on the verge of madness. Am I truly happy? Since childhood, I've often been told I'm fortunate, but I've always felt I was living in hell. And the very people who called me fortunate seemed to me far more at ease than I could ever be. I've sometimes thought that if my neighbor were to shoulder even one of the 10 burdens of misfortune I carry, that single burden would be enough to end his life. I simply don't understand. I have absolutely no grasp of the nature or degree of my neighbor's suffering. Practical suffering, the kind that can be solved simply by having food to eat, is that, in fact, the most intense agony, a horrific, unimaginable hell compared to which my 10 burdens are nothing. I don't understand. But if it is, why don't people kill themselves, or go mad, or stop discussing politics, or give up hope, or surrender the struggle for survival? Aren't they suffering? Have they become perfect egoists, convinced of their own righteousness, never once questioning themselves? If so, their lives must be easy. But aren't all human beings like that, and isn't that perfectly acceptable? I don't understand. Do they sleep soundly at night and wake refreshed in the morning? What kind of dreams do they have? What do they think about as they walk down the street? Money? Surely not just money. I seem to recall hearing the theory that humans live to eat, but I've never heard anyone say they live for money. Or perhaps, depending on the circumstances. No, I don't understand. The more I think about it, the less I understand, and I'm overcome by anxiety and dread, feeling utterly different from everyone else. I can barely hold a conversation with my neighbors. I don't know what to say, or how to say it so. I devised the role of the clown. It was my last attempt at courtship with humanity. It seems I was desperately afraid of human beings, and yet I couldn't bring myself to abandon them entirely. And through this clowning, I was able to maintain a tenuous connection to humanity. Outwardly, I constantly wore a smile, while inwardly, I was desperately, precariously balanced, sweating bullets in my service to others. Even as a child, I had no understanding of what my family members were going through, what they were thinking, how they lived. I was simply terrified of them, unable to bear the awkwardness, and so I became adept at clowning. Without realizing it, I had become a child who never spoke a word of truth. Looking at photographs from that time, when I'm pictured with my family, everyone else has a serious expression, while I'm the only one contorting my face into a strange smile. This, too, was one of my early, pathetic attempts at clowning. I never once talked back to my family, no matter what they said to me. Even the slightest scolding felt like a thunderbolt, driving me nearly mad. Far from talking back, I'd become convinced that the scolding itself must be some kind of absolute, universal truth about humanity, and that since I lacked the ability to live up to this truth, I was no longer fit to live among human beings. That's why I couldn't argue, couldn't defend myself. If someone criticized me, I felt as if I must have made some terrible mistake, and I always accepted the attack in silence, feeling a terrifying sense of dread inside. Perhaps no one enjoys being criticized or scolded, but when someone is angry, I see in their face the true nature of a beast far more terrifying than a lion, a crocodile, or a dragon. They usually conceal this true nature, but on certain occasions, like a cow peacefully grazing in a meadow that suddenly swats a fly on its belly with its tail, they unexpectedly reveal their terrifying true selves through anger. Whenever I witnessed this, I felt a chill that made my hair stand on end. And when I thought that this true nature might also be part of what qualifies a human being to live, I almost despaired. Constantly trembling with fear before human beings, having no confidence whatsoever in my own actions as a human being, I locked my anguish away in a small box inside my chest, concealing my melancholy, my nervousness, and devoted myself to feigning a carefree optimism. I gradually perfected the role of the eccentric clown. All I had to do was make people laugh. If I did that, then perhaps they wouldn't mind too much that I existed outside their so-called lives. In any case, I mustn't be a nuisance to them. The thought that I was nothing, a gust of wind, a patch of sky, grew stronger and stronger, and I used clowning to make my family laugh, and, even more desperately, I performed my clowning service for the servants, who were even more incomprehensible and terrifying than my family. In the summer, I would walk down the hallway wearing a red woolen sweater under my yukata, making everyone in the house laugh. Even my eldest brother, who rarely smiled, burst out laughing at the sight, saying in a tone of voice that suggested he found me unbearably endearing, "Yo, Ha-chan, that doesn't suit you." Of course, even I wasn't so oblivious to heat and cold that I would walk around in a woolen sweater in midsummer. I had slipped my sister's leg warmers onto my arms and let them peek out from the sleeves of my yukata to create the illusion that I was wearing a sweater. My father often had business in Tokyo, so he kept a villa in Sakurajicho, Ueno, and spent most of the month living there. It was his habit, or perhaps one of his hobbies, to buy an enormous amount of souvenirs for his family and even extended relatives whenever he returned home. One evening, before one of his trips to Tokyo, my father gathered his children in the parlor and asked each of us, with a smile, what we'd like him to bring back. He carefully wrote down our answers in a notebook. It was unusual for my father to be so attentive to his children. "What about you, Yozo?" he asked, and I faltered. Whenever I was asked what I wanted, I suddenly found myself wanting nothing. The thought would flicker through my mind, "It doesn't matter, nothing will truly make me happy anyway." At the same time, I was incapable of refusing anything given to me, no matter how little it suited my tastes. Unable to say no to things I disliked, and equally unable to express my desires directly, I would accept things with a bitter sense of resignation, writhing in an indescribable dread. In short, I lacked even the ability to choose between two options. This, I believe, was one of the traits that would later contribute significantly to what I call my life of much shame. Seeing me hesitate and fidget, my father's expression clouded over slightly. A book, then? I saw a lion mask in Asakasa, in Nakamai's Dory. Just the right size for a child to wear and play with. Don't you want that? Once he phrased it as a question, don't you want that? I was done for. I was completely incapable of giving a clowning response. The clown had utterly failed his audition. A book would be fine, my eldest brother said seriously. Is that so? My father seemed disappointed. He didn't write anything in his notebook, but snapped it shut. What a disaster. I had angered my father. His revenge would surely be terrible. That night, I lay in bed trembling, wondering if there was any way to undo the damage. I quietly got out of bed and went to the parlor. I opened the drawer where my father had put his notebook, took it out, flipped through the pages until I found the list of souvenir requests, licked the tip of the pencil attached to the notebook, and wrote lion mask. I didn't want a lion mask in the least. I would have much preferred a book. But I had realized that my father wanted to buy me the lion mask, and I wanted to appease him, to restore his good mood. That's why I went to such lengths, sneaking into the parlor in the middle of the night. And this extraordinary measure of mine met with the resounding success I'd hoped for. When my father returned from Tokyo, I heard him say to my mother in a loud voice from my room, I opened this notebook at the toy store in Nakamai's Dory, and there it was, written here, lion mask. This isn't my handwriting. I wondered. Then it dawned on me. It's Yozo's mischief. He just grinned and kept quiet when I asked him, but later, he must have desperately wanted that lion mask. He's a strange boy, you know. He pretended not to care, but he wrote it down anyway. If he wanted it so badly, he should have just said so. I had to laugh, standing there in the toy store. Call Yozo here, quickly. Meanwhile, I had gathered the servants in the Western-style room. I had one of them bang randomly on the piano keys. Even though we lived in the countryside, our home had almost everything, and I danced an Indian dance to the chaotic music, making everyone roar with laughter. My second eldest brother took a flash photograph of my Indian dance. When the picture was developed, it showed my little penis peeking out from the opening in my loincloth, which was actually a printed furoshiki. This caused another round of laughter throughout the house. For me, this, too, was an unexpected success. Every month, I subscribed to more than 10 new boys' magazines, and I also ordered various other books from Tokyo, which I read in secret. I was well versed in the exploits of Professor Muddled and Professor Nonsense, and I was also fairly knowledgeable about ghost stories, historical tales, comic stories, and Edo anecdotes. I never lacked for material when it came to making my family laugh by saying something absurd with a perfectly straight face, but school, there, I was on the verge of being respected. The very notion of being respected terrified me. I felt as though I had almost completely deceived everyone, and that at any moment, some omniscient, omnipotent being would see through me, expose me, and subject me to a humiliation worse than death. That was my definition of being respected. Even if I deceived people and earned their respect, what if one person knew the truth, and eventually told everyone else, and they realized they'd been tricked? What would their anger, their revenge be like then? The mere thought sent shivers down my spine. I got good grades, not because I came from a wealthy family, but because I was what they call bright. I was a sickly child, and even though I often missed a month or two of school, and even a whole academic year on one occasion, when I returned, still weak from illness, and rode to school in a rickshaw to take the end-of-year exams, I always seemed to perform better than anyone else in my class. Even when I was feeling well, I hardly ever studied. I would spend my class time drawing cartoons, and during breaks, I'd explain them to my classmates, making them laugh. I also filled my composition notebooks with nothing but humorous stories. Even when the teacher reprimanded me, I didn't stop. I knew he secretly enjoyed reading them. One day, as usual, I wrote a particularly mournful account of an incident that occurred on a train trip to Tokyo with my mother, when I peed in the spittoon in the aisle of the passenger car. Though I didn't do it out of childish innocence, I did it deliberately, feigning childish innocence. I was confident that the teacher would find it amusing. I stealthily followed him as he left the classroom. As soon as he stepped into the hallway, he picked out my composition from the stack, began reading it as he walked, and started chuckling. When he reached the staff room, he apparently finished reading it, because he burst out laughing, his face turning bright red. He immediately showed it to the other teachers. I was extremely satisfied, charming. I had succeeded in being seen as charming. I had succeeded in escaping respect. My report card was filled with perfect 10s in every subject, but my conduct grade was always a 7 or a 6, which became another source of amusement for my family, but my true nature was diametrically opposed to that of a charming boy. By then, I had already learned and been subjected to certain deplorable things at the hands of the maids and servants. To do such things to a young child is, I now believe, the most vile, the most base, the most cruel crime a human being can commit. But I endured it in silence. I even felt as though I'd witnessed another aspect of human nature, and I laughed feebly. If I'd been in the habit of speaking the truth, I might have been able to report their crimes to my father or mother without hesitation. But I couldn't fully understand even my own parents. Reporting to another human being, I had no hope in that recourse. Even if I told my father, my mother, the police, the government, in the end, wouldn't I just be subjected to the plausible, socially acceptable excuses of those who were skilled at navigating the world? I knew perfectly well that there would always be some kind of catch, that reporting to another human being was ultimately futile. I felt that all I could do was endure in silence, continuing my clowning. So, you're talking about distrust of humanity? Heh! When did you become a Christian? Some might scoff. But it seems to me that distrust of humanity doesn't necessarily lead directly to religion. In fact, even those who scoff, along with everyone else, live quite comfortably in mutual distrust, without any thought of Jehovah or anything else. I recall another incident from my childhood. A prominent figure in the political party my father belonged to came to our town to give a speech. I was taken to the theater by the servants to hear him. The place was packed. I could see the faces of all the people in town who were particularly close to my father. There was much applause. After the speech, the audience streamed out into the snowy night, heading home in small groups, viciously criticizing the speech. Among them, I heard the voices of some of my father's closest associates. My father's introductory remarks were clumsy, they said, and the famous speaker's speech was incomprehensible gibberish, they declared angrily. And yet, these same people stopped by our house, came into the parlor, and told my father, with expressions of genuine delight, that the speech had been a great success. Even the servants, when asked by my mother how they had enjoyed the speech, replied cheerfully that it had been very interesting. And yet, on the way home, they had lamented to each other that there was nothing more boring than a political speech. But this is just one small example. Human beings deceive each other, and yet, strangely, no one seems to get hurt, or even realize that they're being deceived. It's a remarkably clear, bright, and cheerful kind of distrust that seems to pervade human life. But I'm not particularly interested in the fact that people deceive each other. I deceive people myself, from morning till night, with my clowning. I have little interest in ethics textbook morality or anything like that. What I find baffling are those human beings who seem to possess the confidence to live, or to believe they can live, pure, bright, and cheerful lives while deceiving each other. No one ever explained this mystery to me. If I'd understood, perhaps I wouldn't have been so terrified of human beings, or felt the need to serve them so desperately. Perhaps I wouldn't have been at odds with human life, wouldn't have suffered the nightly torments of hell. In short, the reason I didn't report the servant's despicable crime to anyone wasn't because of distrust of humanity, or, of course, because of Christian principles. It was because human beings had firmly closed the doors of their trust against me, Yozo. Even my parents sometimes showed a side of themselves I couldn't understand. And this scent of my loneliness, the fact that I confided in no one, was instinctively detected by many women, and I believe it became one of the reasons I was taken advantage of in later years. In other words, I was, for women, a man who could be trusted with the secrets of love. Page break. Notebook 2. On a shore so close to the sea that it might be considered the edge of the waves, stood a grove of more than 20 dark-barked mountain cherry trees. When the new school year began, the cherry trees, along with their sticky, brown young leaves, would burst into brilliant bloom against the backdrop of the blue sea. Later, during the season of falling petals, the blossoms would scatter profusely onto the sea, dotting and drifting on the surface, carried by the waves and then washed back onto the sandy shore. This cherry blossom beach served as the schoolyard of the middle school in Tohoku where, despite my lackluster preparation for the entrance exam, I somehow managed to gain admission. The school's cap badge and uniform buttons were adorned with stylized cherry blossoms. Not far from the middle school lived a distant relative of my family. Partly for this reason, my father had chosen this school by the sea and cherry blossoms for me. I boarded with this relative's family, and since the school was so close, I had the rather lazy habit of waiting until I heard the morning assembly bell before running to class. Nevertheless, through my usual clowning, I steadily gained popularity in my class. It was the first time I'd lived away from home, and yet this new place felt much more comfortable than my birthplace. Perhaps this was because my clowning had become so ingrained that I no longer had to struggle as much to deceive people. But more than that, I believe there's an unavoidable difference in the difficulty of acting in front of one's family and in front of strangers, in one's hometown and in a strange land, a difference that exists even for the most talented actors, even for the Son of God himself. For an actor, the most challenging stage is the theater in his hometown, and if his entire family is sitting in the audience, even the greatest actor would find it impossible to perform. But I had performed. And I had achieved considerable success. Having honed my skills to such a degree, there was no chance I would fail in a strange land, and why fear of human beings still churned intensely within me, but my acting became truly uninhibited. In the classroom, I kept my classmates constantly amused, and even the teachers, while lamenting that the class would be much better without Uber, would cover their mouths with their hands to stifle their laughter. I could even make the thundering drill instructor burst into laughter with remarkable ease. Just as I was beginning to think I might have successfully concealed my true nature, I was unexpectedly stabbed in the back. True to form for a backstabber, it was the most physically frail student in the class, with a pale, puffy face, wearing a hand-me-down jacket with sleeves so long they resembled those of Prince Shotoku. He consistently failed his classes and always sat out during drills and physical education, a student who bordered on simple-mindedness. Even I hadn't considered him someone to be wary of. One day, during PE, this student, I don't remember his last name, but I think his first name was Takechi, was sitting out as usual, while the rest of us were practicing on the horizontal bar. I deliberately put on the most serious expression I could muster, shouted heave-ho as I ran toward the bar, and then, as if performing a long jump, I leaped forward and landed squarely on my backside in the sandpit. It was all a calculated failure. As expected, everyone burst into laughter. I got up with a wry smile and brushed the sand off my pants. Takechi, who I hadn't noticed approaching, tapped me on the back and whispered, "Fake. Fake." I was stunned. I never imagined that Takechi, of all people, would see through my act. I felt as though the world had instantly been engulfed in the flames of hell. I almost screamed and nearly lost control, but managed to restrain myself with all my might. The anxiety and dread I felt in the days that followed outwardly, I continued performing my pathetic clowning routine, making everyone laugh. But every so often, a heavy sigh would escape my lips. The thought that Takechi saw through every single thing I did, that he would surely tell everyone sooner or later, made cold sweat break out on my forehead. I'd find myself looking around nervously, with a strange glint in my eye, like a madman. If I could, I would have stayed by Takechi's side day and night, watching him constantly to prevent him from revealing my secret. And while I was at it, I would have done everything in my power to convince him that my clowning wasn't fake, but genuine. Ideally, I would have become his best friend. But if that proved impossible, then I would have no choice but to pray for his death. I was that desperate. Yet, I never considered actually killing him. Throughout my life, I've often wished to be killed, but I've never once desired to kill another person. I always felt that killing someone would only bring happiness to that terrifying individual. In order to win him over, I began by putting on a gentle, pseudo-Christian smile, tilting my head about 30 degrees to the left, lightly putting my arm around his small shoulders, and inviting him, in a sweet, coaxing voice, to come to my lodgings. He always remained silent, his eyes vacant. But one afternoon after school, I think it was early summer, a sudden downpour trapped the students, but since I lived nearby, I dashed out into the rain. I happened to see Takechi standing dejectedly in the shadows by the shoe lockers. "Come on," I said, "I'll lend you my umbrella." I grabbed his hesitant hand, and we ran together through the downpour. When we arrived at my lodgings, I asked my aunt to dry our jackets, and I succeeded in luring Takechi up to my room on the second floor. The household consisted of only 3 people: my aunt, a woman in her 50s, her eldest daughter, a tall, sickly-looking woman in her 30s who wore glasses. She had been married once and then returned home. I called her Anissa, as the others in the household did, and Setchan, Anissa's younger sister, who was short and round-faced, and had recently graduated from girls' school. They ran a small shop downstairs, selling stationery and sporting goods, but their main income seemed to come from the rent of 5 or 6 row houses left to them by my deceased uncle. "My ears hurt," Takechi said, still standing. "They started hurting after I got caught in the rain." I examined his ears and saw that they were oozing pus. It looked as though the discharge was about to overflow. "Oh dear, that's not good." "It must be painful," I exclaimed dramatically. "I'm so sorry I dragged you out into the rain," I added, using overly solicitous language, as if I were a woman. Then I went downstairs and got some cotton and alcohol. I had Takechi lie down with his head on my lap and carefully cleaned his ears. Takechi, apparently oblivious to my manipulative scheme, said, with his head still on my lap, "You'll be popular with girls, I bet." A mindless compliment, but this, perhaps even unbeknownst to Takechi himself, was a terrifying, almost demonic prophecy, as I would later realize. The words "to fall in love" and "to be loved" are vulgar, frivolous, suggesting something cheap and tawdry. No matter how solemn the occasion, if these words are uttered, the whole atmosphere instantly collapses, becomes utterly banal. It's strange, then, that the phrase "the pain of being loved," which sounds literary, doesn't have the same effect as the vulgar "popular with the girls." Takechi, after having his ears cleaned, paid me the absurd compliment about being popular with girls. At the time, I simply blushed and smiled, offering no reply. But the truth is, I did have an inkling of what he meant. However, to say that I had an inkling in response to the vulgarity of popular with the girls seems almost ludicrous, unworthy even of a line in a comic story. I certainly wasn't feeling frivolous or cheap when I had an inkling. Human women were even more incomprehensible to me than men. There were more women than men in my family, and I also had many female cousins, and then there were the maids involved in those crimes. It's no exaggeration to say that I grew up playing mostly with girls. But my interactions with them were always fraught with anxiety, like walking on thin ice. I was completely lost, stumbling around in a fog, occasionally making a misstep that landed me on a tiger's tail, suffering a severe injury, an injury that, unlike a beating from a man, caused an internal hemorrhage of sorts, an intensely unpleasant, lingering wound that was slow to heal. Women would draw you in and then cast you aside. Or they would scorn you and treat you cruelly in public, only to embrace you tightly when no one was around. Women could sleep as deeply as if they were dead. Perhaps women lived only to sleep. I had made these and other observations about women since childhood. They seemed to be of the same species, and yet they were utterly different creatures from men. And these enigmatic, unpredictable creatures were strangely drawn to me. The phrases "popular with the girls" and "well-liked" were entirely inappropriate in my case. Fawned over might come closer to describing the reality. Women seemed to find the clown even more relaxing than men did. When I played the clown, men, at least, wouldn't laugh endlessly. And I knew that if I overdid it with men, I would make a mistake. So I always made sure to stop at the appropriate point. But women had no sense of moderation. They demanded that I continue clowning endlessly, and I would exhaust myself trying to meet their insatiable demand for encores. They laughed so readily. It seems that women, in general, are capable of experiencing greater pleasure than men. Both the older and younger daughters in the family I stayed with during middle school would come to my room on the second floor whenever they had free time. Each time, I would jump with a start, filled with dread. "Studying?" they'd ask. "No," I'd reply, closing my book with a smile. "Today at school, the geography teacher, Mr. Combo." And what flowed from my lips was a stream of insincere, comical tales. "Ha-chan, try on these glasses," Set-chan, the younger daughter, said one evening. She and Anissa had come to my room and, after making me perform my usual clowning routine, she suddenly made this request. Why? Just try them on. Borrow Anis's. She always spoke in this imperious tone. The clown obediently put on Anis's glasses. The two girls instantly collapsed in laughter. You look just like him. Just like Lloyd. At the time, a foreign comedic film actor named Harold Lloyd was popular in Japan. I stood up, raised one hand, and said, "Ladies and gentlemen." On this occasion, to the fans of Japan. I continued, attempting a brief greeting, making them laugh even harder. After that, whenever a Lloyd film came to the local theater, I would go see it, secretly studying his expressions. One autumn evening, I was lying in bed reading when Anissa darted into my room like a bird and suddenly threw herself onto my quilt, sobbing. "You'll help me, won't you, Ha-chan? You will, won't you? We should leave this house, run away together. Help me, please, help me," she cried, saying all sorts of dramatic things. But this wasn't the first time a woman had behaved this way toward me, so I wasn't particularly surprised by Anissa's outburst. In fact, I was rather put off by its banality and emptiness. I quietly slipped out from under the quilt, peeled a persimmon from the fruit bowl on my desk, and offered her a slice. Anissa ate the persimmon, still sniffling, and then said, "Do you have any interesting books? Lend me one." I chose Soseki's I Am a Cat from the bookshelf and gave it to her. "Thank you," Anissa said, smiling shyly as she left the room. But Anissa was not unique. Trying to understand what motivated women, what they were thinking, was always more complicated, more troublesome, and more unsettling to me than trying to fathom the thoughts of an earthworm. However, I'd known since childhood, from experience, that if a woman suddenly burst into tears, offering her something sweet would usually improve her mood. Set-chan, the younger sister, would even bring her friends to my room. I would dutifully entertain them with my clowning, making them all laugh. As soon as her friends left, Set-chan would invariably start gossiping about them. "She's a bad girl, you know. You should be careful," she would always say. If that was the case, I thought, why bother inviting them in the first place? Thanks to Set-chan, almost all the visitors to my room were girls, but this still wasn't the fulfillment of Takeichi's prophecy about being popular with girls. I was simply the Harold Lloyd of Tohoku, Japan. Takeichi's foolish prophecy, so vivid and ominous, would not take on its truly unsettling form for several more years. Takeichi also gave me another significant gift. "It's a picture of a monster," Takeichi said one day, proudly showing me a brightly colored illustration he'd brought with him. I thought. Looking back, it seems as though my future path was decided at that very moment. I knew it was nothing more than Van Gogh's famous self-portrait. Back then, French Impressionist paintings were all the rage in Japan, and most people began their appreciation of Western art with these works. Even middle school students in the countryside, like myself, had seen reproductions of paintings by Van Gogh, Gauguin, Cézanne, and Renoir. I had seen quite a few Van Gogh prints and was fascinated by his brushstrokes and vibrant colors. But I had never thought of them as depicting monsters. How about this one? Is this a monster too? I took Modigliani's art book from the shelf and showed Takeichi the nude figure with skin the color of burnished copper. Wow. Takeichi's eyes widened in amazement. It looks like a horse from hell. So, is it a monster? I want to paint monster pictures like that. Those who are intensely afraid of human beings end up yearning to see even more terrifying monsters with their own eyes. Just as highly strung, easily frightened people pray for even stronger storms, these painters, wounded and terrorized by the monster that is humanity, had come to believe in phantoms, seeing monsters clearly even in the natural light of day. And unlike me, they didn't try to conceal these monsters with clowning. They strived to depict them exactly as they saw them. As Takeichi had said, they boldly painted monster pictures. Here were my future comrades. I was so moved I almost cried. I'll paint too. I'll paint monster pictures. I'll paint horses from hell, I whispered to Takeichi, for some reason lowering my voice dramatically. I had enjoyed both drawing and looking at pictures since elementary school. But my drawings weren't as well received as my compositions. Since I didn't trust human words at all, writing compositions was, for me, just a way of clowning around, a kind of greeting. Throughout elementary and middle school, I had delighted my teachers with my humorous stories, but I found them utterly uninteresting myself. With my drawings, however, excluding cartoons, I made some effort, in my own childish way, to express my subjects. The drawing examples provided at school were boring, and the teacher's drawings were awful, so I had to devise and experiment with various methods of expression on my own. When I entered middle school, I acquired a complete set of oil painting supplies. But even when I tried to imitate the Impressionist style, my paintings remained flat and lifeless, like Chiyogami paper crafts. But Takeichi's words made me realize that my entire approach to painting had been wrong. The naivete, the foolishness of trying to depict beautiful things beautifully. The masters created beauty from the mundane through their subjective vision. They weren't afraid to depict even ugliness, finding joy in the very act of expression. They weren't relying on anyone else's expectations. Takeichi had given me a primitive, yet essential, lesson in painting. I began working on a self-portrait, keeping it hidden from the female visitors to my room. The result was a chillingly bleak painting, even to my own eyes. But this, I thought, is my true self, hidden deep within my heart. Outwardly, I laugh cheerfully, making others laugh, but inwardly, this is the gloomy heart I possess. It can't be helped. I secretly acknowledged this, but I didn't show the painting to anyone except Takeichi. I didn't want to risk having the bleakness beneath my clowning exposed, suddenly becoming the object of suspicion and wariness. And I was even more afraid that people wouldn't recognize it as my true self, but would see it as another one of my comical inventions, laughing at it. That would have been unbearable. So I quickly hid the painting away in the back of a closet. During art class at school, I kept my monster technique a secret, continuing to paint in my usual mediocre style, depicting beautiful things beautifully. That I continued to show my vulnerable side to Takeichi, and I showed him my self-portrait without hesitation. He praised it highly, and I went on to paint 2 or 3 more monster pictures, receiving yet another prophecy from Takeichi: "You'll be a great painter." With these 2 prophecies branded on my forehead, the prophecy about being loved and the prophecy about becoming a great painter, I eventually left for Tokyo. I wanted to go to art school, but my father had always intended for me to go to high school and become a government official. He had made this clear to me, and, incapable of defying him, I passively obeyed. He suggested I try taking the entrance exam in my 4th year of middle school, and since I was tired of the middle school with its cherry blossoms and sea, I left after completing my 4th year, without advancing to the 5th. I passed the entrance exam for a high school in Tokyo and immediately entered the dormitory. But I was so disgusted by the filth and brutality of dormitory life that I couldn't even bring myself to clown around. I had a doctor write me a medical certificate stating that I had pulmonary infiltration, and I left the dormitory, moving into my father's villa in Sakurajicho, Ueno. I simply couldn't handle communal living. And the phrases "the passion of youth" and "the pride of young men" sent chills down my spine. I couldn't relate to that high school spirit at all. The classroom and the dormitory felt like cesspools of distorted sexuality. Even my near-perfect clowning was useless there. My father, when the diet wasn't in session, only stayed at the villa for a week or 2 each month. When he was away, I was alone in the rather large house with an elderly couple who served as caretakers. I frequently skipped school, but I had no desire to go sightseeing in Tokyo. I never did see Meiji Shrine, the bronze statue of Kusunoki Masashige, or the graves of the 47 Ronin at Sengakuji Temple. I spent my days at home, reading and painting. When my father returned to Tokyo, I would dutifully go to school every morning. However, sometimes I would go to the art studio of Mr. Shintaro Yasuda, a Western-style painter in Sendagi, Hongo, and spend 3 or 4 hours practicing drawing. After escaping the high school dormitory, I felt like an auditor, an outsider, even when I attended classes. Perhaps it was just my own resentment, but I felt so out of place that I became even more reluctant to go to school. Throughout elementary school, middle school, and high school, I never understood the concept of school spirit. I never even tried to learn the school song. At the art studio, I learned about alcohol, tobacco, prostitutes, pawn shops, and leftist ideology from a fellow art student. A strange combination, but true nonetheless. The art student's name was Horuki Masao. He was born in downtown Tokyo, 6 years older than me. He had graduated from a private art school, and since he didn't have a studio at home, he continued his studies at Yasuda's studio. "Lend me 5 yen, will you?" he said one day. We had only known each other by sight, never having spoken a word before. I stammered and handed him the money. "Right, let's drink. I'll treat you." "You're a good kid," he said, unable to refuse. I was dragged off to a cafe in Horicho, near the art studio. This was the beginning of our association. "I've had my eye on you for a while now. That shy smile of yours, that's the mark of a promising artist. Cheers to our new friendship. Kinu-san, isn't he handsome? Don't fall for him, though." Sadly, thanks to him showing up at the studio, I'm now only the second most handsome guy here. Horiki had a dark, well-defined face. Unlike most art students, he wore a proper suit, his tie was conservative, his hair neatly parted down the middle and slicked back with pomade. Being in an unfamiliar place, I was terrified. I just sat there, folding and unfolding my arms, wearing that shy smile of mine. But after a few beers, I began to feel a strange sense of liberation, a lightness. "I was thinking of going to art school," I said. "Nah, it's boring. Those places are boring. School is boring. Our teacher is nature. Pathos for nature." But I didn't feel the slightest respect for anything he said. What an idiot, I thought. His paintings must be awful. But he might be fun to hang out with. I had, for the first time in my life, encountered a genuine city slicker. He might be different from me in outward appearance, but in the sense that he was completely detached from the world of human endeavors, lost and adrift, he was undoubtedly my kindred spirit. The essential difference between us was that he clowned around unconsciously, completely oblivious to the pathos of his clowning. I continued to associate with him, looking down on him, sometimes even feeling ashamed of our friendship. But as I walked alongside him, I was eventually defeated, even by this man. At first, I thought he was a good person, an exceptionally good person. Even I, with my fear of human beings, was completely taken in. I felt I'd finally found a good guide to Tokyo. The truth was, I couldn't ride a train alone because I was afraid of the conductor. I wanted to go to the Kabukizie theater, but I was intimidated by the ushers standing on either side of the scarlet carpeted staircase at the main entrance. I was afraid of the waiters who stood silently behind me in restaurants, waiting to clear my plates, especially when it came time to pay the bill. Oh, my clumsy hands. When I bought something and handed over the money, I would become so tense, so embarrassed, so anxious and terrified that I'd feel dizzy, the world would go dark, and I'd practically lose my mind. I'd not only forget to get my change, but I'd even forget to take the item I'd just bought. This happened frequently, so I couldn't bring myself to walk around Tokyo alone. I had no choice but to spend my days lounging around at home, but if I gave my wallet to Horiki and walked with him, he would haggle aggressively, and he was so skilled at spending money, or perhaps just so good at having fun, that he could get the most out of even a small amount. He avoided expensive taxis, skillfully utilizing trains, buses, and even those little steam-powered jitneys, always finding the quickest and cheapest way to get to our destination. On our way home from a brothel in the morning, he'd take me to a certain restaurant for a cheap but luxurious morning bath and a light breakfast of hot sake and tofu. He taught me the value of cheap and nutritious street food like gyudon, beef bowl, and yakitori, grilled chicken skewers. He assured me that nothing beat electric brandy for a quick drunk. In short, when it came to spending money, he never once made me feel anxious or afraid. Another benefit of being with Horiki was that he talked incessantly, pouring out his so-called passions, completely disregarding what I, the listener, might be thinking or feeling. Perhaps passion itself consists of disregarding the other person's feelings. This meant I never had to worry about those awkward silences that I dreaded so much. Being naturally taciturn, I had always resorted to desperate clowning to avoid those terrifying silences when interacting with others. But now, Horiki, the idiot, was unconsciously fulfilling the role of the clown, without even realizing it. All I had to do was listen to his endless chatter, occasionally interjecting a really, or laughing, and that was enough. Alcohol, tobacco, prostitutes. I soon learned that they were all excellent ways to alleviate, at least temporarily, my fear of human beings. I became willing to sell everything I owned to obtain them. Prostitutes seemed to me neither human nor female, but more like imbeciles or madwomen. In their embrace, I felt completely at ease and could sleep soundly. They were all so pathetically devoid of desire. And perhaps sensing a kindred spirit in me, They always treated me with a natural, unforced kindness. Kindness without calculation, kindness without ulterior motives, kindness offered to someone they might never see again. There were nights when I saw the halo of Mary around these simple-minded, or perhaps mad, prostitutes, but as I frequented these places, seeking refuge from my fear of human beings and a brief respite, associating with prostitutes, my kindred spirits, I unknowingly began to exude a certain disreputable aura. This was an unintended bonus, an addendum I hadn't anticipated. Gradually, this addendum became more pronounced, until Haruki pointed it out to me. I was taken aback, and it left a bad taste in my mouth. To put it crudely, I had, through my interactions with prostitutes, received an education in women, and my skills had apparently improved considerably. It seems that prostitutes provide the most rigorous and effective training in this area. I had acquired the scent of a ladies' man, and women, not just prostitutes, instinctively detected it and were drawn to me. This lewd, disreputable aura, this bonus, had become more conspicuous than my need for respite. Haruki may have been partly flattering me, but I, too, had noticed some disquieting signs. I'd received a clumsy love letter from a waitress at a coffee shop. The landlord's daughter next door to the villa in Sakurajicho, a girl of about 20, would stand around by her gate every morning, lightly made up, as if waiting for me to leave for school. When I went to eat beef, the waitresses would. Then there was the tobacconist's daughter, who slipped. And the woman sitting next to me at the Kabuki theater. And one night on the late-night streetcar, I was drunk and asleep, and then, out of the blue, I received a desperate letter from a distant female cousin. And while I was out, some unknown girl left a handmade doll. Because I was so passive, none of these incidents went anywhere. They remained mere fragments, never developing further. But I couldn't deny that there was something about me that seemed to inspire romantic fantasies in women. Being told this by someone like Haruki was humiliating, and I suddenly lost interest in prostitutes. One day, out of his characteristically pretentious modernity, I can't imagine any other reason for it. Even now, Haruki took me to a communist reading group, some sort of secret study session. They called it RS or something like that, I don't remember exactly. For someone like Haruki, a secret communist meeting was probably just another aspect of his Tokyo tour guide service. I was introduced to the comrades, made to buy a pamphlet, and then listened to a lecture on Marxist economics by a hideously ugly young man sitting at the head of the table. But it all seemed self-evident to me. It all made sense, but human hearts contained something far more mysterious and terrifying. It wasn't simply desire, or vanity, or lust. There was something else, something I couldn't quite grasp, something eerily uncanny lurking beneath the surface of human society, something that wasn't just about economics. And I, terrified of this uncanny something, while accepting the so-called materialism as naturally as water flowing downhill, couldn't bring myself to feel liberated from my fear of human beings, to open my eyes to the fresh green leaves and feel the joy of hope. Nevertheless, I attended every single meeting of this RS, or whatever it was called. I might be wrong, amused by the way these comrades sat there with such serious, tense expressions, poring over theories that seemed as simple as elementary arithmetic, like 1 + 1 = 2. I did my best to lighten the mood with my clowning, and perhaps because of this, the atmosphere of the study group gradually became less strained. I even became something of an indispensable, popular figure. These simple people probably thought I was just like them, a simple, optimistic, comical comrade. If so, then I was deceiving them completely. I wasn't a comrade. But I continued to attend the meetings, providing my clowning services. It's because I liked them. I liked these people. But it wasn't necessarily a Marxist camaraderie, illegality. I found it vaguely enjoyable. In fact, it felt comfortable. The legality of the world seemed far more terrifying. I sensed something unfathomably powerful behind it. I couldn't bear to sit in that windowless, drafty room. I'd rather dive into the sea of illegality, even if it meant drowning. There's a word, shadow dweller. It seems to refer to the wretched, the defeated, the immoral in human society. But I've always felt like a shadow dweller myself, right from birth. And whenever I met someone who was labeled a shadow dweller by society, I always felt a surge of tenderness toward them. And this tenderness of mine was, I must admit, a source of self-satisfaction. There's another word, guilt. Throughout my life, I've been tormented by guilt, but it was also my constant companion, like a devoted wife, and I found a strange solace in our solitary, wretched games. There's also the expression "a skeleton in the closet." In my case, the skeleton appeared on one of my shins when I was a baby, and instead of healing as I grew older, it only deepened, reaching the bone, causing agonizing pain that varied nightly through 1,000 hells. And yet, this is a strange way to put it, this wound gradually became more intimate to me than my own flesh and blood. The pain of the wound felt like the living emotion of the wound itself, a whisper of love. For someone like me, the atmosphere of that underground group felt strangely comforting. I felt at home. I was drawn to the texture of the movement itself, more than its actual purpose. As for Horiki, he was just a fool, playing around. He took me to one meeting and never went back. Marxists, he joked, needed to study production, but also needed to observe consumption, and he was much more interested in taking me on consumption observation trips. Come to think of it, there were all sorts of Marxists back then. There were those like Horiki, who adopted the label out of pretentious modernity, and then there were those like me, who were simply drawn to the scent of illegality. If our true motives had been discovered by genuine Marxist believers, both Horiki and I would have been denounced in a fiery rage and instantly expelled as despicable traitors. But neither of us, not even Horiki, was ever expelled. And I, in particular, felt more at ease, more healthy, in that world of illegality than I ever had in the world of law-abiding gentlemen. I became a promising comrade, entrusted with all sorts of ridiculously secretive tasks. And I never refused a single one. I accepted everything cheerfully. Performing these dangerous tasks, the members of the movement were intensely serious, engaging in amateurish spy games, taking extreme precautions, even though the tasks they asked me to perform were utterly trivial. But they were always incredibly tense and anxious about these tasks, with a smile, making others smile. I carried them out meticulously. At the time, I wouldn't have minded becoming a party member and being arrested, even if it meant spending the rest of my life in prison. I thought that prison might actually be more comfortable than living in the world of human real life, terrified of everything, groaning night after night in the hell of insomnia. And my father, at the Sakurajicho villa, was so busy with visitors and outings that even when he was home, we barely saw each other for 3 or 4 days at a stretch. But his presence was suffocating, terrifying. I was thinking of leaving, finding a place of my own, but I couldn't bring myself to tell him. Then, I heard from the old caretaker that my father was planning to sell the villa. His term in the Diet was coming to an end, and there were probably various other reasons as well. He seemed to have no intention of running for re-election. He'd built a retirement home back in our hometown and seemed to have lost his attachment to Tokyo. Perhaps he thought it was pointless to maintain a residence and servants in Tokyo just for me, a mere high school student. Like everyone else, his thoughts were a mystery to me. In any case, the villa was soon sold, and I moved into a gloomy room in a dilapidated boarding house called Senyukan in Morikawacho, Hongo. And I immediately found myself in financial trouble. Until then, my father had given me a fixed monthly allowance. Even if it was gone in 2 or 3 days, there was always tobacco, alcohol, cheese, and fruit at the villa. Books, stationery, and clothes could always be charged to my father's account at the local shops. Even when I treated Horiki to soba or tempura, I could simply walk out of any restaurant favored by my father without paying. Now, suddenly living alone in a boarding house, I had to manage everything with my monthly allowance, and I was completely lost. The money would disappear in 2 or 3 days. I was filled with panic and dread, on the verge of madness from anxiety. I sent a barrage of telegrams and begging letters to my father, brothers, and sisters. The letters were filled with fabricated, clowning tales of woe. I thought the best way to ask someone for money was to make them laugh first. At the same time, following Horiki's advice, I became a regular at the pawn shop. But I was always short of money. I simply lacked the ability to live independently, alone in a boarding house, with no connections whatsoever. I was terrified of being alone in my room, feeling as though I would be attacked at any moment. I would rush out into the streets, running errands for the movement, or drinking cheap sake with Horiki. I practically abandoned my studies and my art. In November of my second year of high school, I attempted a double suicide with a married woman older than myself, and my life changed dramatically. I skipped school constantly, never studied, but somehow, I always managed to write passable exam answers. Until then, I had successfully deceived my family back home. But it seemed the school had finally begun sending confidential reports to my father about my poor attendance. My eldest brother started sending me stern, lengthy letters on my father's behalf. But my more immediate problems were lack of money and the fact that the tasks assigned to me by the movement had become far too demanding and time-consuming to be treated as a mere game. I had become the leader of the action squad, or whatever they called it, for Marxist students in all the schools in the Hongo, Koishikawa, Shitaya, and Kanda districts. I heard the words armed uprising, bought a small knife. Looking back, it was such a flimsy little knife, barely suitable for sharpening pencils, and carried it in the pocket of my student uniform, running around making contacts. I wanted to drink and sleep, but I had no money. And the P, that's what we called the party, I think, but I might be wrong, kept sending me an endless stream of tasks. My frail body couldn't handle it anymore. I had only joined the group out of an interest in illegality. Now that things had gotten so serious, so ridiculously busy, I began to feel a strong resentment toward the P, thinking, shouldn't you be asking your core members to do this? I ran away. Running away didn't make me feel any better, so I decided to die.at the time. There were 3 women who were particularly fond of me. One was the daughter of the landlord at Senyukan. She would come to my room every night after I returned, exhausted from my activities for the movement, and too tired to even eat dinner. She would bring writing paper and a fountain pen and say, "I'm sorry. My younger siblings are too noisy downstairs. I can't write letters in peace." I could have simply pretended to be asleep and ignored her, but she seemed so eager to talk to me that I activated my passive service mode. Even though I didn't want to speak at all, I forced my exhausted body to turn over onto my stomach, lit a cigarette, and said, "I heard there was a man who received a love letter from a woman and was so moved he heated up the bath." "Oh, how awful. That must have been you. I once heated up some milk and drank it. I'm honored. You should drink it." I wished she would just leave. It was obvious she wasn't writing letters. She was probably just doodling. "Let me see," I said, though I had absolutely no desire to see what she'd written. "Oh no, I can't show you," she'd say, playing coy, which I found extremely unattractive and off-putting. I decided to give her an errand. "Excuse me, but could you go to the pharmacy on the streetcar line and buy me some calamine lotion? I'm so exhausted, my face feels flushed, and I can't sleep." "Sorry to trouble you. The money." "Don't worry about the money." She jumped up eagerly. I knew that giving a woman an errand wouldn't offend her. In fact, women seemed to enjoy being asked to do things for men. The second woman was a literature student at the Women's Higher Normal School, a fellow comrade. Because of the movement, I had to see her almost every day. Even after our meetings, she would follow me around and buy me things. "Think of me as your older sister," she would say, with an affected air. Shuddering inwardly, I would reply with a melancholic smile, "I already do." I was afraid of angering her, so I had to keep her happy, which meant serving this unpleasant woman even more devotedly. She would buy me things. They were always things in terrible taste, which I usually gave away to the yakitori vendor. I would put on a cheerful face, tell jokes, make her laugh. One summer night, she refused to leave me, so, just to get rid of her, I kissed her in a dark alleyway. She became ridiculously, hysterically excited. She called a taxi and took me to a small, office-like room in a building that the movement apparently used for secret meetings. We stayed up all night. Some older sister, I thought wryly. Both the landlord's daughter and this comrade were people I had to see almost every day, so, unlike other women, I couldn't avoid them. Driven by my anxiety, I did my best to keep them happy. I was trapped. Around the same time, I received an unexpected kindness from a waitress at a large cafe in Ginza. We'd only met once, but I felt indebted to her, and this indebtedness, coupled with my usual anxiety and dread, made me feel strangely obligated. By then, I had become somewhat bolder, able to ride trains alone, go to the kabukizie, even enter cafes wearing my kajiri kimono, without needing Horiki as my guide. Inwardly, I was still afraid of human confidence and aggression, but outwardly, I had learned to greet people with a straight face, or at least, to attempt a greeting, though I could never manage it without my strained, clowning smile, my smile of defeat. But I had acquired the skill, perhaps thanks to running around for the movement, or perhaps thanks to women, or alcohol, but mostly thanks to my financial difficulties, of exchanging greetings with people. I still felt terrified wherever I went, so I thought that perhaps being surrounded by the crowds of drinkers, waitresses, and waiters in a large cafe might provide some relief from my constant anxiety. I went into a large cafe in Ginza with 10 yen in my pocket and said to the waitress with a nervous laugh, "I only have 10 yen, just so you know." "Don't worry about it," she said, with a hint of a Kansai accent. And for some reason, her words calmed my trembling heart. It wasn't that I was no longer worried about the money. It was that I felt, being near her, that I didn't have to worry about anything. I drank. Feeling at ease with her, I didn't feel the need to clown around. I showed her my true self, my taciturn, gloomy self, and drank in silence. "Would you like some of this?" she asked, placing various dishes in front of me. I shook my head. "Just alcohol?" "I'll join you." It was a cold autumn night. I went to a sushi stall in the backstreets of Ginza, as Tsuniko, that's what I remember her name being, but my memory is hazy, and I might be wrong. I'm the kind of person who forgets even the name of someone I attempted suicide with, had instructed, and ate some rather tasteless sushi. Though I've forgotten her name and even her face, I still remember how bad the sushi was. And I can still clearly picture the bald sushi chef, with his snake-like face, shaking his head as he expertly, or so he pretended, mold the rice. Years later, I'd see someone on a train and think, I know that face. And then I'd realize, with a wry smile, that they resembled the sushi chef. Even now, having forgotten Tsuniko's name and face, the fact that I can still vividly recall the sushi chef's face suggests just how bad the sushi was, how much cold and discomfort it caused me. I'd never enjoyed sushi, even at supposedly good restaurants. The pieces were always too big. Couldn't they make them the size of a thumb? I always wondered, waiting for her. She had rented a room on the second floor of a carpenter's house in Honjo. There, in that room, I didn't hide my usual gloom. I sat drinking tea, holding my cheek as if I had a terrible toothache. And for some reason, she seemed to like this about me. She, too, seemed surrounded by a cold wind, as if swirling with fallen leaves, utterly alone as we lay together. She told me that she was 2 years older than me, that her hometown was Hiroshima, that she was married, that her husband had been a barber in Hiroshima. Last spring, they had run away to Tokyo together, but her husband hadn't found steady work, and he was now in prison for fraud. She visited him every day, bringing him things, but she was going to stop tomorrow, she said. But for some reason, I've never been interested in women's stories about their lives. Perhaps it was because they were bad storytellers, or perhaps they simply placed emphasis on the wrong things. In any case, I always found them tedious, lonely. I'd hoped that she, unlike other women, would express a sentiment I could relate to, but even from her, I never heard that word. But while she didn't say she was lonely, she radiated an intense loneliness, like an aura extending an inch or so from her body. When I was near her, I, too, was enveloped in this aura. It blended with my own prickly gloom, and like a dead leaf settling on a rock at the bottom of a stream, I felt free from fear and anxiety. Unlike the comforting sleep I found in the arms of those simple prostitutes, those prostitutes, by the way, were cheerful. The night I spent with the fraudster's wife was a happy one. I don't intend to use such a presumptuous word again in this entire memoir. I felt liberated, but it was only one night. When I woke up in the morning, I was back to my usual frivolous, clowning self. Cowards are even afraid of happiness. They get hurt by cotton wool. They get hurt even by happiness. I wanted to leave quickly, before I was hurt, surrounding myself with the smoke screen of my clowning. When the money's gone, the love is gone. You know, that saying's been misinterpreted. It doesn't mean that when a man runs out of money, the woman leaves him. It means that when a man runs out of money, he becomes despondent, useless. His laughter loses its strength. He becomes bitter and resentful. Finally, in desperation, he leaves her. He dumps her in a frenzy. That's what it means, according to the great Konozawa dictionary. Poor thing. I understand how he feels. I seem to recall saying something ridiculous like that, making Tsuniko burst out laughing. A long visit was dangerous, so I quickly left, without even washing my face. But my offhand remark about when the money's gone, the love is gone would later have unexpected consequences. About a month later, I was drinking cheap sake with Horiki at a street stall in Kanda. Even after we left the stall, Horiki insisted on drinking more. We had no money left, but he kept saying, let's drink, let's drink. I was feeling bold from the alcohol, so I said, all right, I'll take you to the land of dreams. Prepare to be amazed. A veritable land of milk and honey. A cafe. Yeah. Let's go. Horiki became boisterous. I'm starving for a woman tonight. Can I kiss the waitress? I didn't like it when Horiki behaved this way. He knew this, so he was checking with me beforehand, all right? I'm going to kiss her. I'm going to kiss the waitress who sits next to me. Okay. I don't care. Thank you. I'm starving for a woman. We got off the streetcar at Ginza 4 Chum and entered the so-called land of milk and honey, a large cafe. We were practically penniless, relying on Tsuniko as our lifeline. We sat down at an empty booth, and Tsuniko and another waitress immediately rushed over. The other waitress sat next to me, and Tsuniko sat next to Horiki. I was taken aback. Tsuniko was about to be kissed. I didn't feel possessive. I've never been one to cling to things, and even when I felt a flicker of attachment, I lacked the energy to assert my ownership and fight for it. Later in my life, I even witnessed my common-law wife being violated without saying a word. I wanted to avoid human conflict. I was terrified of being drawn into it. Tsuniko and I had only spent one night together. She wasn't mine. I couldn't possibly feel possessive. And yet, I was taken aback. I felt sorry for Tsuniko, imagining her being subjected to Horiki's forceful kiss. Defiled by Horiki, Tsuniko would surely leave me. And I didn't have the passion to stop her. This is the end, I thought, momentarily stunned by Tsuniko's misfortune. But I quickly resigned myself, as easily as water flowing downhill. I looked from Horiki's face to Tsuniko's and smiled faintly, but the situation took an unexpected, and even worse, turn. Forget it. Horiki said, grimacing. Even I wouldn't. She's so pathetically shabby. He folded his arms and stared at Tsuniko with a look of utter disgust, forcing a smile. Get us some drinks. I don't have any money, I whispered to Tsuniko. I wanted to drink myself into oblivion. In the eyes of the world, Tsuniko wasn't even worth a drunken kiss. She was just a shabby, pathetic woman. This realization struck me like a thunderbolt, both expected and unexpected. I wanted to drink, more than I ever had before. I wanted to get completely drunk, look at Tsuniko, and exchange a sad smile. As I thought, she really is a pathetically shabby woman, a feeling of kinship, of shared poverty. The disparity between rich and poor, however cliched, remains an eternal theme of human drama, I now believe, welled up inside me. I felt a tenderness toward Tsuniko. For the first time in my life, I felt a faint, yet active stirring of love. I vomited. I blacked out. It was the first time I'd ever been so drunk. When I woke up, Tsuniko was sitting beside my pillow. I was in her room, on the second floor of the carpenter's house in Honjo. You said, when the money's gone, the love is gone. I thought you were joking. But you really meant it, didn't you? You didn't come see me. That's a strange way to end things. Even if I earned the money, it wouldn't be enough, would it? No. We lay together again, and as dawn approached, the word death came from her lips for the first time. She seemed utterly exhausted by the human struggle for existence. I, too, felt overwhelmed by my fear of the world, the endless anxieties, the money, the movement, the women, my studies. I didn't think I could endure it any longer. I readily agreed to her proposal, but even then, I wasn't truly resolved to die. It still felt like a game. That morning, we wandered around Osaka's Roku district. We went into a coffee shop and drank milk. You pay, she said. I stood up, took my coin purse from my pocket, and opened it. 3 copper coins. I was overwhelmed by a sense of humiliation so profound it was almost horrific. I instantly pictured my room at Senyukan, barren except for my uniform and bedding, nothing left to pawn. And then I realized that all I owned in the world was the kajiri kimono and the coat I was wearing. This was my reality. I couldn't go on living like this. Seeing me hesitate, Tsuniko stood up and looked into my purse. Is that all? she asked innocently. And her words pierced me to the core. It was the voice of the first woman I had ever loved, and that's why it hurt so much. 3 copper coins wasn't even money. It was a humiliation unlike any I had ever experienced. A humiliation I couldn't live with. It seems I hadn't yet fully shed my identity as a rich boy. At that moment, I made a conscious, deliberate decision to die that night. We jumped into the sea at Kamakura. Tsuniko took off her obi, saying, "This obi belongs to a friend. I borrowed it from the shop." She folded it carefully and placed it on a rock. I took off my coat and placed it beside the obi. Then we walked into the water together. She died. I survived, perhaps because I was a high school student, and perhaps because my father's name had some news value. The incident was reported prominently in the newspapers. I was taken to a hospital by the sea. A relative came from my hometown and took care of everything. He told me that my father and the entire family were furious, and that I might be disowned. But I didn't care about that. I missed Tsuniko. I cried and cried. Of all the people in my life, I had truly loved only her, that shabby, pathetic Tsuniko. I received a long letter from the landlord's daughter, containing 50 tanka poems. Every single one began with the strange phrase, "Live on." The nurses at the hospital would come to my room, laughing cheerfully, and one of them would squeeze my hand before leaving. At the hospital, they discovered a problem with my left lung. This turned out to be quite convenient. Eventually, I was taken from the hospital to the police station, charged with aiding and abetting suicide. But the police treated me like a patient and placed me in a special holding cell. Late at night, the elderly officer on duty in the adjacent room quietly opened the connecting door and called out to me. He said, "You must be cold. Come in here and warm yourself." I meekly entered the duty room and sat down by the brazier. "You must miss her, the woman who died," he said. "Yes," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "That's only natural," he said, his voice growing louder, more self-assured. "Where did you first, with a woman?" he asked, putting on a show of delicacy, like a judge. He assumed I was a child and, to pass the time on a long autumn night, he was pretending to be the interrogator, hoping to extract some salacious confession from me. I saw through his scheme instantly and had to struggle to keep from laughing. I knew I didn't have to answer his unofficial questions, but to add to the amusement of the long autumn night, I put on a performance of utter sincerity, as if I believed he was the chief interrogator, and that the severity of my punishment depended entirely on his whim. I gave him a vague, partially satisfying confession to appease his lecherous curiosity. "All right, I think I understand. If you answer truthfully, we'll take that into consideration," he said. "Thank you very much." "I appreciate it," I replied. It was a truly masterful performance. A tour de force that benefited me not in the least. The next morning, I was summoned by the chief. This was the official interrogation day. As soon as I opened the door and entered his office, he said, well, what a handsome young man. It's not your fault. It's your mother's fault for giving birth to such a handsome son." He was a relatively young chief, with a dark complexion, and he looked like he'd gone to university. His words made me feel like a freak, a deformed, pathetic creature with a hideous birthmark covering half my face. His interrogation, unlike the lecherous, persistent questioning of the elderly officer the previous night, was brisk and efficient. He looked like a judo or kendo athlete. When the questioning was over, he began filling out the paperwork for the prosecutor's office. "You need to take better care of yourself," he said. "You seem to be coughing up blood." I had developed a cough, and I'd been covering my mouth with a handkerchief whenever I coughed. The handkerchief was stained with blood, like red hailstones. But it wasn't blood from my throat. It was from a small boil I'd been picking at under my ear. But I had a feeling it would be advantageous not to explain this, so I simply replied meekly, "Yes," lowering my eyes. The chief finished writing and said, "Whether or not you're indicted is up to the prosecutor, but you should contact your guarantor, by telegram or telephone, and ask them to come to the prosecutor's office in Yokohama today. You have someone, don't you? A guardian or a guarantor?" I remembered Shibuta, an art and antique dealer from my hometown, a portly, unmarried man in his 40s who was always flattering my father and served as my guarantor at school. My father always called him Flounder because of his resemblance to the fish, especially his eyes, and I had adopted the nickname as well that I borrowed the police telephone directory and looked up Flounder's number. I found it and called him, asking him to come to the prosecutor's office in Yokohama. He sounded surprisingly arrogant, but he agreed. Hey, you should disinfect that phone immediately. He's coughing up blood, you know, I heard the chief's loud voice say to his officers after I returned to the holding cell in the early afternoon. I was taken to Yokohama by train. My wrists were tied together with thin hemp rope, though I was allowed to conceal the rope with my coat. A young officer held the end of the rope firmly in his hand, but I felt no anxiety whatsoever. The holding cell, even the old officer, seemed familiar, almost comforting. Oh, why am I like this? Being treated like a criminal, bound and restrained, actually made me feel calm and relaxed. Even now, as I write about it, the memory fills me with a sense of ease and contentment. But even during this relatively peaceful period, there was one incident, a horrific blunder that made me break out in a cold sweat, a blunder I'll never forget. I was taken to a dimly lit room at the prosecutor's office for a brief interrogation. The prosecutor was a quiet man in his late 30s, with a face that could be described as having a righteous beauty, an air of intelligence and serenity. Even if I had been handsome, it would have been a lewd handsomeness, I suppose. He didn't seem like the fussy type, so I let down my guard and answered his questions vaguely. Suddenly, I started coughing. I took out my handkerchief, saw the blood, and, in a moment of despicable calculation, thought, perhaps this cough can be useful. I exaggerated the cough, hack, and covered my mouth with the blood-stained handkerchief. I glanced at the prosecutor. In that instant, he said, with a quiet smile, "Really?" I broke out in a cold sweat. Even now, the memory makes me cringe. It was worse than that time in middle school when Takechi, that idiot, tapped me on the back and whispered, "Fake, fake," sending me plummeting into hell. Those two incidents are the greatest acting failures of my life. I would have preferred a 10-year prison sentence to that quiet, contemptuous look from the prosecutor. The charges against me were dropped. But I felt no joy, only a profound sense of misery. I sat on a bench in the waiting room at the prosecutor's office, waiting for Flounder to arrive. Through the high window behind me, I could see the sunset sky. A seagull flew past, its shape resembling the kanji character for woman. Page break. Notebook 3. Part 1. One of Takechi's prophecies came true, and one did not. The less flattering one, about being popular with girls, proved accurate. But the more auspicious one, about becoming a great painter, did not. I became, at best, an obscure, mediocre cartoonist for cheap magazines. Expelled from high school because of the Kamakura incident, I lived in a small, 3-mat room on the second floor of Flounder's house. A small amount of money was sent from home each month, not directly to me, but secretly to Flounder, and it seemed that my brothers were sending it secretly, without my father's knowledge. All other ties with my family were severed. Flounder was constantly irritable, never laughing at my attempts at humor. His transformation was so dramatic, so swift and complete, that it was almost comical. "Don't go out. Just stay inside," he kept telling me. He seemed to think I was a suicide risk, that I might jump into the sea again, following the woman's ghost. He forbade me to leave the house. But without alcohol or tobacco, I had no desire to kill myself. I spent my days huddled under the kotatsu in my 3-mat room on the second floor, reading old magazines, living like an idiot. Flounder's house was near the medical school in Okubo. His shop, Siryuan, Art and Antiques, had a rather grand-sounding name, but it was just one half of a small, 2-family house. The shopfront was narrow, the interior dusty and filled with cheap junk, though Flounder's business wasn't based on selling this junk. He seemed to make his money acting as a middleman, arranging the transfer of valuable items from one wealthy client to another. He rarely spent any time in the shop. He would leave early each morning with a serious expression on his face, leaving a boy of 17 or 18 in charge. This boy also served as my guard. He would spend his time playing catch with the neighborhood kids, but he treated me, the lodger, like an idiot or a madman, lecturing me with the self-importance of an adult. Incapable of arguing with anyone, I would listen to his lectures with a weary, almost admiring expression, feigning obedience. The boy was Flounder's illegitimate son. For some complicated reason, Flounder refused to acknowledge him publicly. And Flounder's bachelorhood seemed to be related to this situation. I'd heard rumors about it from my family, but I wasn't interested in other people's affairs, so I knew nothing for certain. But the boy's eyes, too, had a fishy quality, so perhaps he really was Flounder's son. If so, they were a lonely pair. Late at night, they would secretly order soba noodles and eat together in silence in the damp, 4.5-mat room downstairs, without offering me any point. One evening in late March, Flounder, perhaps having stumbled upon a lucrative deal, or perhaps having some other scheme in mind, even if both of these assumptions were correct, there were probably other, more complicated reasons I couldn't fathom, invited me downstairs to dine with him. The table was unusually well set, with sake and dishes. He served slices of tuna sashimi, expressing his own admiration for the treat, and offered me some sake. "So, what are you planning to do?" he asked. Instead of answering, I picked up a dried sardine from a dish on the table and stared at its silvery eyes. The sake was beginning to take effect. I felt a pang of nostalgia for my carefree days, even for Horiki. I longed for freedom. I almost started to cry since coming to Flounder's house. I hadn't even felt like clowning around. I'd simply resigned myself to being an object of contempt for Flounder and his son. Flounder, too, seemed to avoid engaging in any lengthy conversations with me. I had become a dull, apathetic lodger. Being cleared of the charges means you don't have a criminal record. So, with the right attitude, you can rehabilitate yourself. If you're truly repentant, and you come to me and ask for my advice, I'll consider helping you, Flounder said. His way of speaking, like everyone else's, was so convoluted, so vague, so evasive. His excessive caution, his endless, seemingly pointless maneuvering always confused me. I'd give up and either deflect his words with clowning, or simply nod silently, surrendering to his will. Years later, I learned that all he needed to say was, "Enroll in a school in April, whether it's a public or private one. Your family will send more money once you're enrolled." That's how things actually were. And I would have obeyed. But because of Flounder's unnecessarily cautious, roundabout way of speaking, things became complicated, and the course of my life changed drastically. "If you're not willing to come to me and ask for my advice, there's nothing I can do," he said. "What kind of advice?" I had no idea what he meant. "Well, what's on your mind? For example, what are you going to do with yourself? Should I get a job? No, what do you want to do?" Why didn't he just say, "The money will come from home"? If he'd said that, my mind would have been made up. But I was completely lost. "So, do you have any hopes for the future? Do you have any aspirations? You, being cared for, have no idea how difficult it is to care for someone. I'm sorry. It's a constant worry. I've taken on the responsibility of looking after you, so I don't want you to be half-hearted about this. I want to see that you're serious about turning your life around. For example, if you came to me and seriously discussed your plans for the future, I would be willing to listen. Of course, I'm just a poor Flounder, so you can't expect the same luxuries as before. But if you're determined, if you have a clear plan for your future, and if you come to me and discuss it, I'm willing to help you, even if it's just a little bit at a time. Do you understand my feelings? So, what are you planning to do? If I can't stay here, I'll have to get a job. Are you serious? In this day and age, even if you graduate from Tokyo Imperial University. No, I don't want to be a salaryman. Then what? A painter. I finally blurted it out. A painter? I'll never forget the sly look on Flounder's face as he chuckled. It wasn't exactly contempt, but something else, a glimpse into the dark depths of adult life, as if such a strange shadow lurked 1,000 fathoms deep in the sea of the world. He told me that wasn't a serious answer, that I wasn't thinking clearly, that I should think it over, think hard about it tonight. I went back upstairs, feeling pressured. I lay in bed, but no thoughts came to me. As dawn approached, I ran away from Flounder's house. I'll be back this evening without fail. I'm going to my friend's house to discuss my future plans, so please don't worry. Sincerely. I wrote this in large letters on a piece of stationery, added Horiki Masoro's name and address in Asakasa, and quietly slipped out of Flounder's house. I didn't run away because I was offended by Flounder's lecture. I was, as he said, indecisive, with no clear plan for the future. I felt bad for Flounder, imposing on his hospitality. And even if I did manage to pull myself together and come up with a plan, The thought of relying on that poor flounder for financial support was unbearable, but I didn't seriously intend to go to Horiki for advice. I had simply written Horiki's name and address on the note on a whim, wanting to reassure Flounder, to buy myself some time to escape, though perhaps there was also a touch of the fugitive's desire to throw the police off my trail. But more than that, I was afraid of shocking Flounder, of upsetting him with my sudden departure. That's why, even though I knew he would eventually find out the truth, I couldn't bring myself to tell him directly. I had to embellish, to add a touch of deception. This pathetic habit of mine, this need to add a layer of ornamentation, even when it would ultimately be to my own detriment, resembled what people call lying. But I rarely did it for my own benefit. It was simply that the sudden shift in atmosphere, the shattering of the illusion, was so terrifying, so suffocating, that I felt compelled to add that one little touch of deception, driven by a desperate, albeit distorted, feeble, and foolish, desire to serve, to please. And this habit would later be greatly exploited by the so-called honest people of the world. That I left Flounder's house and walked to Shinjuku, where I sold the book I had with me. And then I was lost again. I was friendly with everyone, but I'd never experienced true friendship. Aside from casual acquaintances like Horiki, all human interaction was painful. I would exhaust myself with clowning, trying to alleviate the pain. Even the mere sight of someone I knew, or even someone who resembled someone I knew, would make me jump with a start, sending a wave of unpleasant dizziness through me. I knew I was liked, but it seemed I lacked the capacity to love others, though I seriously doubt whether most human beings possess this capacity for love. Someone like me could never have a true friend. And I didn't even have the ability to visit people. The gates of other people's houses seemed more forbidding to me than the gates of hell in Dante's Inferno. I felt, without exaggeration, as though terrifying, dragon-like beasts lurked within. I had no friends. I had nowhere to go. Horiki.it was a joke that had gotten out of hand. Just as I'd written in my note, I decided to go to Horiki's house in Asakasa. I'd never visited him before. I'd always summoned him by telegram. But now, even the cost of a telegram seemed extravagant. And in my current state of destitution, I thought he might not come even if I sent a telegram. So, despite my aversion to visiting, I decided to go to him. I sighed and boarded the streetcar, realizing that Horiki, of all people, was my only lifeline. The thought sent a chill down my spine. Horiki was home. He lived on the second floor of a 2-story house down a dirty alleyway. He had a single 6-mat room. Downstairs, his elderly parents and a young craftsman were making Jita sandals, stitching and hammering the straps. That day, Horiki showed me a new side of his urban personality, his shrewdness. It was a cold, calculating egotism that stunned me, the country bumpkin. He wasn't like me, a man adrift in the currents of life. I'm appalled by you. Has your father forgiven you yet? He asked. I couldn't bring myself to tell him I'd run away. I lied, as usual. Even though I knew he'd see through me instantly. It'll work out, I said. This isn't a laughing matter. Let me give you some advice. Stop acting like an idiot. I'm busy today. I've been incredibly busy lately. Busy doing what? Hey, don't pull the threads out of the cushion. As we were talking, I had unconsciously been fidgeting with the threads of the zabuton cushion I was sitting on, pulling at one of the tassels. Horiki, apparently valuing even a single thread of his family's possessions, reprimanded me without a trace of embarrassment. Come to think of it, Horiki had never lost anything in our association. Horiki's mother brought in 2 bowls of oshiruko, sweet red bean soup with mochi, on a tray. Oh, this is, Horiki said, turning to his mother with an exaggerated show of filial piety, speaking in an unnaturally polite tone. I'm sorry, oshiruko? How extravagant. You shouldn't have gone to all this trouble. I have to go out soon, on business. But it would be a shame to waste your delicious oshiruko. Thank you. Would you like some? My mother made it especially for us. Ah, this is delicious. How extravagant. He seemed genuinely delighted, eating with gusto. It didn't seem entirely like an act. I took a sip. It tasted of hot water, and the mochi wasn't like any mochi I'd ever had before. I wasn't disgusted by its poverty, I didn't think it tasted bad, and I was touched by his mother's kindness. I've always been afraid of poverty, but I don't think I've ever felt contempt for it. But the oshiruko, and Horiki's delight in it, revealed to me the true nature of urban life, the way Tokyo people carefully maintained a distinction between their public and private selves. I, the naive fool, constantly fleeing human life, unable to distinguish between my inner and outer self, felt utterly alone, abandoned even by Haruki. As I fumbled with the chipped lacquer chopsticks, I felt an unbearable sense of loneliness. "That's all I want to say, sorry, but I have to go out today," Haruki said, standing up and putting on his jacket. "Excuse me." Just then, a woman came to visit Haruki, and my situation suddenly changed. Haruki became animated. "Oh, I'm so sorry. I was just about to come see you. But this person has come unexpectedly." "No, it's all right. Please, come in." He seemed flustered. He snatched the zabuton cushion I offered the woman, flipped it over again for some reason, and urged her to sit down. There was only one guest cushion in the room. Besides Haruki's own, the woman was thin and tall. She pushed the cushion aside and sat down near the entrance. I listened vaguely to their conversation. She seemed to be a magazine editor, and she had commissioned Haruki to do some illustrations, which she had come to collect. "I'm in a hurry," she said. "It's done. It's been done for a while now. Here you are." A telegram arrived. Haruki read it. His cheerful expression instantly darkened. "Damn. What's this?" It was from Flounder. "You have to come back immediately. I would take you back myself, but I don't have time right now. Running away from home. And you have the nerve to look so nonchalant. Where do you live?" the woman asked. "Okubo," I blurted out. "That's near our office," she said. The woman was from Yamanashi Prefecture and 28 years old. She lived in an apartment in Koenji with her 5-year-old daughter. Her husband had died 3 years earlier, she said. "You seem like someone who's been through a lot. You're very thoughtful." "It's a shame," she said, "and so I began my life as a kept man. When Shizuko, that was the editor's name, went to work at the magazine office in Shinjuku, I would stay home with her 5-year-old daughter, Shigeko. Until then, Shigeko had apparently stayed with the apartment manager while her mother was at work. But now, she had a thoughtful uncle to play with, and she seemed delighted. I stayed there for about a week, drifting aimlessly. A kite was caught on the power lines just outside the apartment window. It flapped in the dusty spring breeze, gradually tearing, but stubbornly refusing to come loose. It seemed to be nodding its head in agreement. Every time I saw it, I cringed, blushing, even dreaming about it, waking up in a sweat. "I need money," I said to Shizuko. "How much?" "A lot. When the money's gone, the love is gone." "It's true. Don't be ridiculous. That's such an old-fashioned." "Is it? But you don't understand. If things go on like this, I might have to leave. Who's the poor one here? And who's leaving whom? That's ridiculous. I want to earn my own money, buy alcohol, or at least tobacco. And I think I'm a much better painter than Haruki." Whenever I talked about painting, I would remember the self-portraits I'd painted in middle school, the ones Takechi had called monster pictures. Lost masterpieces. They had disappeared during one of my many moves. But I felt they were truly good paintings. Everything I'd painted since then paled in comparison. I was constantly plagued by a dull sense of loss, as if something precious had been taken from me. A half-empty glass of absinthe. That's how I secretly described this irretrievable sense of loss. Whenever the subject of painting came up, I would picture that half-empty glass of absinthe, and I'd be filled with a longing to show those paintings to Shizuko, to make her believe in my talent. "Oh, really? You're so cute when you're serious and telling jokes," she said. It wasn't a joke. It was true. I wanted to show her those paintings. Frustrated, I gave up and said, "Cartoons, at least. I think I'm better at cartoons than Haruki." She seemed to take my clowning, my attempt at deflection, seriously. "You are. I've been meaning to tell you. The cartoons you draw for Shigeko. They're so funny, even I can't help laughing. You should try submitting them somewhere. I could talk to the editor-in-chief at my magazine." Her magazine was a little-known monthly publication for children. Most women want to do something for you when they see you. You're always so timid, and yet, you're a comedian. Sometimes, you seem so lost in your own thoughts, and that's what intrigues women, makes them want to help you. Even though Shizuko flattered me, saying all sorts of things like that, the thought that this was the essence of being a kept man, a gigolo, only made me feel more despondent. I wanted to escape from Shizuko, to earn my own living. But I found myself becoming increasingly dependent on her. She took care of everything, dealing with the aftermath of my running away from Flounder's house. I became even more timid around her thanks to Shizuko's efforts. A meeting was arranged between Flounder, Haruki, and Shizuko. I was officially disowned, and I began living with Shizuko. Thanks to her efforts, my cartoons started bringing in a decent income. I could buy alcohol and tobacco again. But my anxiety, my sense of unease, only intensified. I sank deeper and deeper into despondency. As I worked on my monthly serial for Shizuko's magazine, The Adventures of Kinta and Ota, I would suddenly remember my family home, and be overcome with such loneliness that I couldn't hold back my tears. During those times, Shigeko was my only solace. She had started calling me Daddy without hesitation. Daddy, is it true that God will give you anything you ask for if you pray? I wanted to pray myself. Oh, God, grant me a cold heart. Reveal to me the true nature of humanity. Is it not a sin for one human being to push aside another? Grant me a mask of anger. Yes, that's right. He'll give you anything, Shigeko. But maybe not Daddy. I was even afraid of God. I couldn't believe in God's love, only in God's punishment. Faith. To me, it felt like bowing my head before the judgment seat, waiting to receive God's lash. I could believe in hell, but I couldn't believe in heaven. Why not Daddy? Because I disobeyed my parents. Really? Everyone says you're a very good person. That's because I'm deceiving them, I thought. I knew that the people in the apartment building were fond of me. But how could I explain to Shigeko that the more I feared them, the more they liked me, and the more they liked me, the more terrified I became, the more I needed to distance myself from them? This unfortunate affliction of mine. What do you want to ask God for, Shigeko? I changed the subject casually. I want my real daddy. She said that I was stunned, dizzy. An enemy. Was I Shigeko's enemy, or was she mine? Suddenly, I saw her as another terrifying adult, a stranger, an incomprehensible stranger, a stranger full of secrets. I had thought Shigeko was different. But she, too, possessed that cow's tail, ready to swat a fly. From that day on, I became timid even around Shigeko. Hey, sex fiend. You home? Haruki had started visiting me again. He was the same man who had abandoned me so cruelly on the day I ran away from Flounder's house. And yet, I couldn't refuse him. I greeted him with a faint smile. Your cartoons are becoming quite popular, I hear. Amateurs have a reckless audacity that's hard to beat. But don't get complacent. Your drawing skills are still lacking. He even adopted a condescending, teacher-like tone. I wondered what he would say if he saw my monster paintings. Writhing inwardly, I said, don't even mention it. You'd scream in terror. Haruki seemed even more smug. Talent for navigating the world will only get you so far. Talent for navigating the world. I could only laugh bitterly. Me? Talent for navigating the world? But perhaps my way of fearing, avoiding, and deceiving people was a kind of shrewd, cunning strategy, like the proverb, let sleeping dogs lie. Oh, how little human beings understand each other. We mistake each other completely, thinking we're best friends, and then, when one of us dies, we weep and read eulogies. Haruki, having been involved in the aftermath of my running away from home, though Shizuko must have pressured him into it, acted as though he were my savior, my matchmaker. He adopted a serious expression and lectured me. He would come to visit late at night, drunk, and stay over. He would borrow 5 yen, always 5 yen, but you should rein in your womanizing. Society won't tolerate it, he said. What is society? A collection of individuals? Where does this society exist? Until then, I had always thought of it as something powerful, strict, and terrifying. But Haruki's words made me think, society is you, isn't it? The words were on the tip of my tongue, but I held them back, afraid of angering him. Society won't tolerate it. Not society. You won't tolerate it. If you do that, society will punish you. Not society. You will punish me. Society will ostracize you. Not society. You will ostracize me. Know thyself. Know your own fears, your strangeness, your malice, your cunning, your wickedness. These words swirled in my mind, but I simply wiped the sweat from my face with a handkerchief and said with a laugh, cold sweat, cold sweat. But from that moment on, I began to think, is society nothing more than the individual? And once I began to think that society might be nothing more than the individual, I became slightly more capable of acting according to my own will. To borrow Shizuko's words, I became a little more selfish, less timid. To borrow Horiki's words, I became strangely stingy. And to borrow Shigeko's words, I became less affectionate toward her. I became taciturn, rarely smiling. I spent my days looking after Shigeko, working on the adventures of Kinta and Ota, a blatant imitation of the popular Nonki na Tozen, easygoing dad, called Nonki na Osho, easygoing priest, and another serial called Sekachi Pinchan, impatient Pinchan, the title of which even I didn't understand, a product of my desperation. I fulfilled the orders from various publishers. Shizuko had managed to get me work from other publishers besides her own, but they were all third-rate, publishing vulgar, sensationalist magazines. I worked slowly. I was a very slow draftsman, driven solely by the need for alcohol money. When Shizuko came home from work, I would leave the apartment and drink cheap, strong sake at street stalls and stand-up bars near Koenji Station. Slightly tipsy, I'd return to the apartment. You have such a strange face. I got the idea for Nonki na Osho's face from watching you sleep. Shizuko would say, your face looks much older when you're sleeping. Like a 40-year-old man, I'd reply, that's your fault. You're sucking the life out of me. Life is like the flow of a river. Why so gloomy, Kawabata? Don't be silly. Go to sleep. Or would you like some dinner? She was always calm and unfazed. I'll have some sake. Life is like the flow of a river. Life is like the flow of water. No, water is like the flow of water. I would sing as Shizuko undressed me. I would rest my forehead against her breast and fall asleep. This was my daily routine, and the next day, I would repeat the same routine. Following yesterday's precedent, needing no other guide but if one avoids the turbulence of great joys. Then naturally, great sorrows will not come either. A toad will circumvent the obstacle of a stone in its path. When I came across these lines, translated by Ueda Bin from a poem by someone called Guy Charles Crows, I blushed crimson. A toad, that's me. It doesn't matter whether society approves or disapproves, condemns or pardons. I'm a creature lower than a dog, lower than a cat. A toad. Just crawling along. I began drinking more and more. I would go to Shinjuku and Ginza, not just Koenji. I would stay out all night. I would act like a hooligan in bars, kissing women indiscriminately. I had reverted to my pre-suicide attempt self, only more dissolute and vulgar. Desperate for money, I even started pawning Shizuko's clothes. A little over a year had passed since I had first chuckled at the torn kite. It was the season of falling cherry blossoms. I secretly took some of Shizuko's clothes, pawned them, and went drinking in Ginza. I stayed out for 2 nights. On the 3rd night, feeling rather unwell, I returned to the apartment, unconsciously softening my footsteps as I approached Shizuko's room. I heard Shizuko and Shigeko talking. Why does Daddy drink so much? Daddy doesn't drink because he likes it. He's too good of a person, so. Do good people drink a lot? Not necessarily, but. Daddy will be so surprised. He might be angry. Look, look. It jumped out of the box. Just like Sekachi Pinchan. Yes, it is. I heard Shizuko's low, happy laugh. I opened the door a crack and peeked inside. It was a baby rabbit. It was hopping around the room, and Shizuko and Shigeko were chasing it. They're happy. I, the idiot, have intruded on their happiness. I'm going to ruin their lives. Such modest happiness. A good mother and daughter. Happiness. Oh, if God would only listen to the prayer of someone like me, just once, just this once, I would pray. I wanted to kneel down right there and clasp my hands together in prayer. I quietly closed the door and went back to Ginza. I never returned to that apartment. I ended up living with another woman, the madam of a stand-up bar near Kyobashi, again as a kept man society. I was beginning to understand it, vaguely. It was a struggle between individuals, a struggle for immediate victory. Human beings never truly submit to each other. Even slaves find ways to rebel, however subtly. So, human beings have no choice but to rely on these one-on-one battles to survive. We proclaim grand principles, But our true aim is always the individual. We overcome one individual only to face another. The complexities of society are the complexities of the individual. The vast ocean isn't society, it's the individual. I was beginning to feel less intimidated by the illusion of the world, less burdened by endless anxieties. I learned to act more boldly, more brazenly, responding to immediate needs, without overthinking things. That I left the Koenji apartment. I left her, I told the madam of the Kyobashi bar. That was all I needed to say. The battle was won. That night, I moved into her room on the second floor. And yet, society, which I had always feared, did nothing to harm me. And I offered no explanations. If the madam accepted me, that was all that mattered. That I was something between a customer, a husband, an errand boy, and a relative at the bar. From the outside, my position must have seemed incredibly ambiguous. But no one questioned it. The regulars called me Ha-chan, treated me kindly, and bought me drinks. I became less wary of the world. It wasn't such a terrifying place after all, I thought. My previous fears had been like the scientific superstitions that had haunted me. The spring breeze carrying millions of whooping cough germs, millions of eye-damaging germs lurking in public baths, millions of baldness germs in barbershops, scabies mites swarming on the hand straps of trains, tapeworm larvae, and who knows what other parasites hiding in raw fish and undercooked meat, tiny shards of glass entering the soles of my bare feet and migrating through my body to pierce my eyeballs, causing blindness. It's true that millions of germs exist, scientifically speaking. But if I simply ignored them, they became nothing more than scientific ghosts, with no power over me. I had been tormented by scientific statistics. 3 grains of rice left uneaten in a lunchbox, multiplied by millions of people, equaling tons of wasted rice, or how much pulp could be saved if millions of people used 1 less tissue per day. I was terrified of wasting even a single grain of rice, of using a tissue, imagining mountains of rice, mountains of pulp being consumed because of me, feeling as though I were committing a terrible crime. But these were scientific lies, statistical lies, mathematical lies. 3 grains of rice couldn't be collected and measured like that. It was as absurd as calculating the probability of someone falling into the hole of a dark, unlit outhouse, or how many passengers out of 1,000,000 would get their foot caught in the gap between the train door and the platform. These hypothetical scenarios, presented as scientific facts, had terrified me. Now, I felt a fondness for my former, naive self, and I wanted to laugh. I was beginning to understand the true nature of the world. Part 2. Haruki and I, mutually contemptuous, mutually destructive, our relationship was a textbook example of what the world calls friendship. Thanks to the madam's generosity, it's a strange word to use, generosity, but in my experience, women, especially in the city, were far more generous than men. Men were always timid, cautious, and stingy. I was able to make Yoshiko, the girl from the tobacco shop, my common-law wife. We rented a room on the ground floor of a small, 2-story wooden apartment building near the Sumida River in Tsukiji. I stopped drinking and devoted myself to my cartooning career. After dinner, we would go to the movies, and on the way home, we'd stop at a coffee shop, or buy a potted plant. More than anything, I enjoyed listening to Yoshiko's words, watching her movements, knowing that she trusted me completely. I began to feel a glimmer of hope, that perhaps I, too, could become a human being, that perhaps I could avoid a tragic end. Then, Haruki reappeared. Yo, sex fiend. Well, you're looking a little more respectable. I'm here as a messenger from the Koenji lady. He lowered his voice and gestured toward Yoshiko, who was preparing tea in the kitchen. Is it all right? He asked. It doesn't matter. She can hear anything, I replied calmly. Yoshiko, a true genius of trust, never suspected anything, not about the madam, not even about the Kamakura incident. I told her everything, sometimes quite bluntly, but she seemed to take it all as a joke, still carrying that baggage. I see. Nothing serious. She just wanted me to tell you to come visit sometime, Haruki said. Just when I'm about to forget, the monstrous bird swoops down and tears open the wound of memory with its beak. The past, the shame, the guilt, come flooding back, filling me with such terror that I can barely sit still. Let's drink, I said. All right, Haruki replied. Haruki and we were similar. Sometimes, I felt as though we were the same person. Of course, This was only when we were drinking cheap sake together. But whenever we met, we would instantly transform into two identical dogs, with the same fur, the same gait. Running through the snowy streets from that day on, we rekindled our old friendship. We went drinking together at the little bar in Kyobashi. And eventually, those two drunken dogs even found their way to Shizuko's apartment in Koenji, staying the night. I'll never forget it. It was a humid summer night. Haruki showed up at my apartment in Tsukiji around dusk, wearing a wrinkled yukata. He said he'd pawned his summer suit and needed to redeem it immediately, but he couldn't let his mother find out. He needed money. I didn't have any, so, as usual, I asked Yoshiko. She took some of her clothes to the pawn shop. After giving the money to Haruki, we still had some left over, so we bought some shochu, distilled liquor, for Yoshiko. We went up to the roof of the apartment building and sat there, enjoying the occasional whiff of sewage from the Sumida River, our shabby little summer party. We started playing a game I'd invented, comedy noun, tragedy noun. I believed that all nouns should be categorized not only as masculine, feminine, or neuter, but also as comedic or tragic. For example, steamship and train were tragedy nouns, while streetcar and bus were comedy nouns. Anyone who couldn't grasp this distinction wasn't qualified to discuss art. A playwright who inserted a tragedy noun into a comedy, or vice versa, was a failure. Alright, tobacco? I asked. Trag, Haruki replied instantly. Short for tragedy. Medicine? Powder or pills? Injection. Trag. Are you sure? There are hormone injections. No, definitely trag. The needle itself. It's trag. Fine, I'll concede. But doctors and medicine, they can be you know. Short for comedy. Death. Commander priests and monks too. Excellent. So, life is trag. Wrong. Life is No, then everything becomes One more question. Cartoonist? Trag. Major tragedy noun. Looks like you're the major trag. It was a silly game, full of bad puns, but we were convinced it was the most sophisticated game ever devised. I had invented another similar game, antonym. The antonym of black is white. But the antonym of white is red. And the antonym of red is black. The antonym of flower? Haruki screwed up his face in concentration. Let me see. There's a restaurant called Kagetsu, Flower Moon, so, moon. No, that's not an antonym. That's a synonym. Star and violet are synonyms, not antonyms. I know. Peony. Ant. No, that's just using them as painting subjects. Don't cheat. I know. Flower. Scattered clouds. Scattered clouds and moon. Right. Flower. Wind. The antonym of flower is wind. No, that sounds like a line from a Naniwabushi ballad. You're showing your age. No, biwa, lute. Even worse. The antonym of flower should be something completely flower-like. So, wait a minute. Woman. And the synonym for woman? Innards. You have no sense of poetry. So, the antonym of innards? Milk. That's not bad. One more. Shame. The antonym of shame. Shamelessness. Like the popular cartoonist, Kamitsugi Ikuta. And Haruki Masao? By this point, we'd stopped laughing. The shochu had taken effect, filling our heads with shards of glass, plunging us into a familiar gloom. Don't be smart. I've never been publicly humiliated like you, Haruki said. I was startled. Haruki hadn't been treating me like a human being. He saw me as a walking corpse, a shameless, idiotic monster, and he was simply using me for his own amusement. It wasn't a true friendship. I felt a pang of resentment. But then again, he wasn't wrong. I had always been a child unfit for human society. Perhaps his contempt was justified. Sin. What's the antonym of sin? This is a difficult one, I said, trying to sound casual. Law, Haruki replied nonchalantly. I stared at him. In the flickering red light of the neon sign on a nearby building, his face looked stern, like a police detective. I was speechless. Sin isn't. It's not like that, I said. The antonym of sin is law. But perhaps that's how most people thought, how they lived their lives, so self-assured. Sin exists only where there is no law enforcement, then what? God. You have a religious streak, you know. It's annoying. Don't dismiss it so easily. Let's think about it. It's an interesting question. I think you can tell everything about a person by their answer to this question. Really? The antonym of sin is good. Good, upstanding citizens. Like me. Let's be serious. Good is the antonym of evil. Not of sin. Evil and sin are different. I think so. Good and evil are human concepts. Moral terms invented by human beings. You're so annoying. So, it's God, then. God, God. You can't go wrong with God. I'm hungry. Yoshiko is cooking broad beans downstairs. Great. I love broad beans. He lay back, clasping his hands behind his head. You don't seem to be interested in sin at all, I said. Of course not. I'm not a sinner like you. I might be a playboy, but I've never driven a woman to suicide, or stolen money from a woman. I hadn't driven her to suicide. I hadn't stolen the money. A faint, yet desperate voice of protest rose within me. But then I thought, no, it's my fault. This habit of mine, this inability to argue, to defend myself. I desperately tried to control my rising anger, fueled by the shochu. I spoke in a low voice, almost to myself, but being imprisoned isn't the only sin. If I knew the antonym of sin, I think I could understand what sin really is. God, salvation, love, light. But God has Satan as its antonym. The antonym of salvation is suffering. The antonym of love is hate. The antonym of light is darkness. The antonym of good is evil. Sin and prayer, sin and repentance, sin and confession, sin and... Oh, they're all synonyms. What's the antonym of sin? The antonym of tsumi, sin, is mitsu, honey. Sweet as honey. I'm hungry. Bring me something to eat. Why don't you get it yourself? I burst out, my voice filled with a rage I'd never expressed before. All right, I'll go downstairs and commit a sin with Yoshiko. Practical experience is better than theoretical discussion. The antonym of sin is mitsumame, sweetened beans and agar, no, broad beans. He was almost too drunk to speak coherently. Do whatever you want. Just go away. Sin and hunger. Hunger and broad beans. No, those are synonyms. He stood up unsteadily. Crime and punishment. Dostoevsky. The thought flickered through my mind. What if Dostoevsky hadn't seen crime and punishment as synonyms, but as antonyms? Crime and punishment, two utterly separate, irreconcilable things, like fire and ice. Dostoevsky's dark, murky world, the rotting pond, the tangled threads, crime and punishment as antonyms. I think I'm getting it. No, not yet. Images flashed through my mind. Hey, we have a situation. Come here. Horoki's voice was sharp, his face pale. He had just gone downstairs, and now he was back. What is it? He seemed strangely agitated. We went back down to the second floor, and then down the stairs to my room. Horoki stopped halfway down and whispered, "Look." The small window above my room was open. We could see inside. The light was on. Two animals were there. My head spun. This, too, is a human form. This, too, is a human form. Don't be surprised. I repeated these words to myself, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I forgot about saving Yoshiko. I stood frozen on the stairs. Horoki coughed loudly. I ran back up to the roof and lay down, staring at the rain-soaked summer night sky. The emotion that overwhelmed me wasn't anger, or disgust, or even sadness. It was a profound, primal terror. Not the fear of ghosts in a graveyard, but the kind of inexplicable, ancient dread one might feel encountering a white-clad deity in a cedar grove. My hair began to turn grey that night. I lost all confidence in myself, all trust in others. I abandoned all hope, all joy, all connection with the world. It was a defining moment in my life. I had been struck between the eyes, and from then on, the wound would ache whenever I encountered another human being. I sympathize, but I think you've learned your lesson. I'm never coming here again. This place is hell. But forgive Yoshiko. You're no saint yourself. Excuse me. Horoki wasn't one to linger in an uncomfortable situation. I sat up and drank the rest of the shochu. Then I cried. I cried and cried. At some point, Yoshiko appeared beside me, holding a plate piled high with broad beans. He said he wouldn't. Don't say anything. You didn't know. You didn't know how to distrust people. Sit down. Let's eat. We sat side by side, eating the beans. Oh, God, is trust a sin? The man was a small, uneducated merchant in his late 20s who had been paying me to draw cartoons, haggling over every yen. He never came back, of course. But strangely, I felt more anger and resentment toward Horiki, who had seen everything, who had coughed loudly instead of immediately coming back to tell me, than toward the merchant himself. The thought tormented me, keeping me awake at night. There was no question of forgiving or not forgiving. Yoshiko was a genius of trust. She didn't know how to distrust people. And that's why it was so tragic. I asked God, is trust a sin? What tormented me wasn't the fact that Yoshiko had been violated, but the fact that her trust had been violated. To me, with my nervous, timid nature, always reading people's expressions, my own ability to trust shattered, Yoshiko's innocent faith had seemed as pure and refreshing as a waterfall. And now, in a single night, it had been transformed into a stream of dirty, yellow water. From that night on, Yoshiko became self-conscious, constantly watching my every expression. Hey, I'd say, and she would flinch, her eyes darting around nervously. No matter how hard I tried to make her laugh, to amuse her with my clowning, she remained anxious and timid, speaking to me in excessively polite language. Is innocent trust the source of all sin? I started reading stories about wives who had been unfaithful. But none of them seemed as tragic as Yoshiko. It wasn't even a story. If there had been some kind of affection between Yoshiko and that small merchant, perhaps it would have been easier to bear. But it had been just one summer night, one act of trust. And because of it, I had been struck between the eyes, my voice had become hoarse, my hair had started turning grey, and Yoshiko would live in a state of perpetual anxiety. Most of the stories focused on whether or not the husband would forgive his wife. But that didn't seem like such a difficult question to me. How fortunate to be the husband, with the power to forgive or not forgive. If I couldn't forgive, I'd simply divorce my wife and find a new one. And if I couldn't do that, then I'd just forgive her and endure. In any case, it was the husband's decision, and everything would be resolved. In other words, such incidents, while undoubtedly shocking for the husband, were still just shocks, not the relentless, crashing waves of despair. They were problems that could be resolved by the husband's anger, by his authority. But in our case, I, the husband, had no authority. It was all my fault. I couldn't bring myself to be angry, to scold her. And Yoshiko, she had been violated because of her greatest virtue, her innocent trust. Is innocent trust a sin? I began to doubt even the most precious of virtues. I no longer understood anything. My only recourse was alcohol. My face became haggard. I started drinking shochu in the morning. My teeth began to rot. My cartoons became increasingly vulgar. No, I'll be honest. I started copying pornographic pictures and selling them. I needed money to buy shochu. Looking at Yoshiko, always averting her eyes, always so anxious, I started to wonder, was that night with the merchant the only time? What about Horiki? Or perhaps other men I didn't know about? Suspicions bred suspicions. I didn't have the courage to confront her directly. Tormented by anxiety and dread, I drank shochu to numb the pain. I would try to extract information from her with clumsy, leading questions, my heart rising and falling with each answer. I clowned around frantically, and then, I would make love to Yoshiko, a desperate, degrading act, and collapse into a drunken sleep. Late one night, near the end of the year, I came home drunk. I wanted some sugar water. Yoshiko seemed to be asleep, so I went to the kitchen myself and looked for the sugar bowl. I opened it. It was empty, except for a small, black cardboard box. I picked it up and looked at the label. My blood ran cold. The label was partially scratched off, but the lettering was still visible. Dial, dial. I was drinking shochu now, not using sleeping pills. But insomnia was a chronic problem for me, so I was familiar with most sleeping pills. That box of dial contained more than a lethal dose. The box was still sealed, but she must have intended to use it eventually. She had hidden it in the sugar bowl, scratching off the label. Poor Yoshiko. She probably couldn't read the English lettering, so she thought scratching it off would be enough. You're not to blame. I quietly filled a glass with water, opened the box, poured the contents into my mouth, and drank the water. I turned off the light and went to bed. I was unconscious for 3 days, apparently. The doctor assumed it was an accident and didn't report it to the police. When I regained consciousness, the first words I uttered were, "I want to go home." Where I meant by home, I don't know. I cried and cried. The fog gradually cleared. Flounder was sitting by my bedside, looking extremely displeased. This is the second time, right before the new year. We're all incredibly busy at this time of year. You can't do this to us. He was talking to the madam of the Kyobashi bar. "Madam," I said. "Oh, you're awake?" She smiled down at me. Tears streamed down my face. "I want to leave Yoshiko," I blurted out. The words surprised even me. The madam sat up with a faint sigh. Then, I said something even more ridiculous, more absurd, something so ludicrous that it defies description. "I'm going where there are no women," I said. Flounder burst out laughing. "Ha, ha, ha. That's a good one. You should go where there are no women. Women are trouble. Where there are no women. That's a brilliant idea. Where there are no women." This foolish remark of mine would later be fulfilled in a most unsettling way. Yoshiko seemed to think I had taken the poison in her place. She became even more anxious around me, never smiling, barely speaking. I couldn't bear to be in the apartment, so I went out drinking again. But after the dial incident, I had become incredibly thin and weak. I felt constantly fatigued. I started neglecting my cartooning work. Flounder had left some money when he visited. He'd presented it as a token of Shibuta's concern, as if it were his own money. But it was clearly from my brother's. Unlike the time I ran away from Flounder's house, I now understood his pretentious charade. So, I played along, thanking him profusely for his generosity. But I still couldn't understand why they went to such lengths, why they had to make things so complicated. I used that money to take a trip to a hot spring resort in southern Aizu. But I wasn't in the mood for a relaxing vacation. I missed Yoshiko terribly. I couldn't bring myself to appreciate the scenery. I didn't even change into a yukata or go to the baths. I would rush out of my room and drink shochu at a cheap tea house until I was drunk. I returned to Tokyo feeling even worse. It was a snowy night in Tokyo. I was walking through the back streets of Ginza, drunk, singing softly to myself, hundreds of miles from home. Hundreds of miles from home, kicking at the falling snow. Suddenly, I vomited. It was my first hemorrhage. A large, red, rising sun flag appeared on the snow. I crouched down for a moment, then scooped up some clean snow and washed my face, crying, "Whose small path is this? Whose small path is this?" I heard a faint, phantom-like voice, a child's voice, singing. Misfortune. There are many unfortunate people in this world, perhaps even most people are unfortunate. But they can protest their misfortune to society, and society will understand and sympathize. My misfortune, however, stemmed entirely from my own sins, so I had no one to blame. And if I even hinted at a complaint, people, like Flounder, would be appalled. Am I selfish, or am I simply too weak? I don't understand myself. But I seem to be a mass of sin, destined for misfortune, with no way to prevent it. I stood up and decided to buy some medicine. I went into a nearby pharmacy. The woman behind the counter looked at me, her eyes widening in surprise. She froze. But there was no disgust or revulsion in her eyes. It was almost a look of pity, of longing. She must be unhappy too, I thought. Unhappy people are sensitive to the unhappiness of others. Then I noticed that she was standing unsteadily, leaning on a crutch. I resisted the urge to rush over to her. As I continued to look at her, tears welled up in my eyes. And then, tears started streaming down her face too. Without saying a word, I left the pharmacy and stumbled back to my apartment. I had Yoshiko make me some salt water, which I drank. I went to bed and pretended to have a cold the next day, staying in bed all day. That night, worried about my secret hemorrhage, I went back to the pharmacy. This time, I smiled and confessed everything to the woman, asking for her advice. "You have to stop drinking," she said. We were kindred spirits. "I think I'm an alcoholic. I still crave alcohol." "You mustn't drink." My husband, even though he had tuberculosis, insisted that alcohol killed germs, and he drank himself to death. I'm so anxious. I'm terrified. I'll give you some medicine. But you mustn't drink. The woman, a widow with a son who was studying medicine at a university in Chiba, but who had recently contracted the same illness as his father and was now hospitalized, leaving her alone with her bedridden, stroke-afflicted father-in-law. She herself had contracted polio at the age of 5, which had left one of her legs paralyzed, hobbled around on her crutch, gathering various medicines for me. This is a hematinic. This is a vitamin injection. Here's a syringe. These are calcium tablets and diastase, to prevent stomach upset. This is. She explained each of the 5 or 6 medicines with loving care. But this unfortunate woman's love was too much for me. Finally, she handed me a small, wrapped box, saying, "This is for when you absolutely can't resist the urge to drink." It was morphine. It's less harmful than alcohol, she said. I believed her. And I had become disgusted with alcohol myself. I was happy to be free from that demon, at least for a while. Without hesitation, I injected the morphine into my arm. My anxiety, my restlessness, my timidity, all vanished. I became cheerful and talkative. The morphine gave me energy, and I worked diligently on my cartoons, coming up with ideas so bizarre that they made me laugh. I started with 1 injection a day, then 2, then 4. Soon, I couldn't work without it. You mustn't overdo it. You'll become addicted, the woman at the pharmacy warned me. Her words made me feel as though I were already addicted. I'm very susceptible to suggestion. If someone tells me, "Don't spend this money," and then adds, "But it's your money," so, I feel strangely obligated to spend it, as if I'm betraying their expectations by not doing so. My fear of addiction made me buy even more morphine. "Please. Just 1 more box. I'll pay you at the end of the month. I don't care about the money, but the police." Oh, why was I always surrounded by this murky, disreputable aura? "Please, just this once. I'll kiss you." She blushed. I pressed my advantage. "I can't work without it. It's like an aphrodisiac." "Then you should try hormone injections." "Don't be ridiculous. I can't work without alcohol or morphine." "You mustn't drink." "I know. I haven't had a drop of alcohol since I started using morphine. I feel much healthier. I don't intend to keep drawing these stupid cartoons forever. I'm going to quit drinking, get healthy, study hard, and become a great painter. This is a crucial time for me. So, please, can I kiss you?" She laughed. "You're incorrigible. Don't blame me if you become addicted." She hobbled over to the shelf, took down the morphine, and said, "I can't give you a whole box. You'll use it all up immediately. Just half. You're so stingy." Oh well. I went home and immediately injected myself. "Doesn't it hurt?" Yoshiko asked anxiously. "Of course it hurts. But I have to do it to be productive. Don't I seem energetic lately? All right, back to work. Work. I pretended to be enthusiastic. One night, I knocked on the pharmacy door. The woman came out in her nightgown, hobbling on her crutch. I grabbed her and kissed her, pretending to cry. She silently handed me a box of morphine. By the time I realized that morphine was even more degrading and disgusting than alcohol, I was completely addicted. I was utterly shameless. I would copy pornographic pictures to get money for morphine, and I even started a sordid affair with the crippled woman at the pharmacy. I want to die, I thought. I want to die. It's too late. No matter what I do, I'm doomed. I'm just adding layers of shame. I'll never see the green waterfall with Yoshiko. Sins upon sins, piling up, the agony intensifying. I want to die. I have to die. Life itself is a sin. But even as I thought this, I continued to run back and forth between my apartment and the pharmacy, like a madman, and no matter how much I worked, the cost of the morphine always exceeded my earnings. I owed the woman at the pharmacy a terrifying amount of money. She would cry when she saw me, and I would cry too. Hell, this is my last resort, I thought. If this fails, I'll hang myself. I wrote a long letter to my father, confessing everything, except for the women, staking my very existence on the hope that he would help me, but things only got worse. I received no reply. My anxiety intensified, and I increased my morphine intake. That afternoon, I decided to inject 10 ampoules at once and jump into the Sumida River. Then, as if guided by demonic intuition, Flounder appeared with Horiki. "I hear you've been coughing up blood," Horiki said, sitting cross-legged in front of me, smiling gently. I'd never seen him look so kind. I was so grateful, so happy, that I turned away to hide my tears. And with that single, gentle smile, I was completely defeated, utterly destroyed. They put me in a car. I needed to be hospitalized, they said. "Leave everything to us." Flounder spoke in a soothing, almost compassionate tone. I meekly obeyed, crying like a child, incapable of thought or resistance. The four of us, including Yoshiko, rode in the car for a long time. As dusk approached, we arrived at a large hospital in the woods. I thought it was a sanatorium. A young doctor examined me gently, carefully. Then he said, with a shy smile, "You'll be staying here for a while to recuperate." Flounder, Horiki, and Yoshiko left me there. Yoshiko handed me a furoshiki bundle containing a change of clothes. Then, silently, she took a syringe and the remaining morphine from her obi and gave them to me. She still thought it was an aphrodisiac, I suppose. "No, I don't need it anymore," I said. It was a rare moment of defiance. In my entire life, I had almost never refused anything offered to me. I was terrified of refusing, convinced that it would create an irreparable rift between myself and the other person. But that day, I refused the morphine, the very thing I had been so desperately craving. Had I been struck by Yoshiko's divine ignorance? Perhaps I was no longer addicted. The young doctor, with his shy smile, led me to a ward and locked me in. It was a mental hospital. My foolish remark after taking the dial, about going where there are no women, had been fulfilled in a most bizarre way. The ward was filled with male patients. The nurses were all male. There were no women. I was no longer a criminal, but a madman. No, I wasn't mad. Not for a single moment. I've never been mad. But then again, that's what all madmen say, apparently. Those who are locked up are mad, and those who aren't are normal. I asked God, "Is non-resistance a sin?" I had wept at Horiki's strangely beautiful smile, passively allowing myself to be taken to the hospital, where I was labeled a madman. Even if I were to leave this place, I would still be a madman, a cripple, branded for life. A disqualified human. I was no longer human. I arrived at the hospital in early summer. Through the iron bars of the window, I could see red water lilies blooming in a small pond in the hospital garden. 3 months passed. Cosmos flowers began to bloom in the garden. Then, unexpectedly, my eldest brother came to take me home, accompanied by Flounder. My father had died of a stomach ulcer at the end of the previous month, he said. They no longer cared about my past, he said. They would provide for me. I didn't have to do anything. But I had to leave Tokyo immediately and recuperate in the countryside. Shibuta had taken care of everything in Tokyo, so I didn't have to worry about it. He spoke in his usual serious, tense manner. I pictured the mountains and rivers of my hometown and nodded faintly. A cripple. After learning of my father's death, I became even more listless. He was gone. The presence that had haunted me, both comforting and terrifying, was no longer there. It felt as though a heavy weight had been lifted from my chest. Perhaps my father had been the source of my suffering. I felt strangely empty. I had even lost the ability to suffer. My eldest brother kept his promise. He bought a small, dilapidated thatched roof house for me in a remote hot spring village by the sea, a 4 or 5 hour train ride south from my hometown. It was unusually warm for Tohoku. The house had 5 rooms, but it was quite old, the walls crumbling, the pillars riddled with insect holes, practically beyond repair. He provided me with a servant, an ugly, red-haired woman in her late 50s. 3 years passed. During that time, I was subjected to certain indignities by the old woman, Tetsu. We would occasionally quarrel, like a married couple. My health fluctuated. I gained and lost weight. I coughed up blood. Yesterday, I asked Tetsu to go to the village pharmacy and buy me some calamine lotion. She came back with a box that looked different from the usual one. I didn't think much of it and took 10 tablets before going to bed. But I couldn't sleep. I started feeling strange, and I had to rush to the toilet. I had terrible diarrhea, and I had to go back 3 more times. I examined the box. It was Henomotin, a laxative that I lay in bed with a hot water bottle on my stomach, thinking I should scold Tetsu. This isn't calamine lotion. This is henemotin. I started to say, and then I burst out laughing. Cripple. It seems to be a comedy noun. Taking a laxative when you want to sleep, and the name of the laxative is henemotin. I no longer feel happiness or unhappiness. Everything passes that I end the world of human beings, where I have lived in a state of constant torment. That's the only truth I've found. Everything passes that I'm 27 years old this year. My hair has turned almost completely white, so most people think I'm over 40. Afterward. I don't know the madman who wrote this memoir personally. However, I do know someone who resembles the madam of the Kyobashi stand-up bar described in the memoir. She was a small woman, with a pale complexion, narrow, upturned eyes, and a high-bridged nose. More like a handsome young man than a beautiful woman. The memoir seems to depict Tokyo in the early 1930s, but I visited that small bar in Kyobashi a few times with a friend in the late 1930s, around the time the Japanese military began to become openly aggressive, so I never met the man who wrote this. In February of this year, I visited a friend who had evacuated to Funabashi City in Chiba Prefecture. He was a classmate of mine from university, now a lecturer at a women's college. I had asked him to help arrange a marriage for a relative of mine, and since I was going to Funabashi, I thought I'd buy some fresh seafood for my family. I set off with a rucksack on my back. Funabashi is a fairly large town by a muddy bay. Even when I asked for directions using the address my friend had given me, the locals couldn't seem to find it. It was cold, my shoulders ached from the weight of the rucksack, and, drawn by the sound of a violin playing on a record player, I went into a coffee shop. The madam looked familiar. I asked, and she turned out to be the madam of the small bar in Kyobashi. She recognized me immediately. We exchanged exaggerated expressions of surprise and laughter, and then, as is customary on such occasions, we recounted our experiences of being bombed out during the air raids, each trying to outdo the other with tales of hardship. You haven't changed a bit, she said. Don't be silly. I'm an old woman now. My body is falling apart. You look young. Nonsense. I have 3 children now. I'm out shopping for them today. We exchanged the usual pleasantries and then caught up on the lives of our mutual acquaintances. Then, she suddenly changed the subject and asked if I knew Yozo. I said I didn't. She went into the back and returned with 3 notebooks and 3 photographs, which she handed to me. You might find this useful for a novel, she said. That I'm not one to write based on someone else's material, so I almost returned them immediately. But I was intrigued by the photographs. I've described their strangeness in the preface, so I decided to keep the notebooks for a while. I'll stop by again on my way back, I said. Do you know where Professor so-and-so lives? He teaches at a women's college. As fellow newcomers to Funabashi, we were both unfamiliar with the area, but she knew the professor. He apparently came to the coffee shop occasionally. His house was nearby. That night, I stayed at my friend's house, sharing a few drinks with him. I stayed up all night, reading the notebooks. The story was set in the past, but it seemed relevant to contemporary readers. I felt that publishing it as it was, without any embellishment from me, would be more meaningful. I contacted a magazine and arranged for its publication. The seafood I brought back for the children was just dried fish. I stopped by the coffee shop on my way home. Thank you again for last night. By the way, I began, then hesitated. Could I borrow these notebooks for a while longer? Yes, of course. Is he still alive? I have no idea. The package containing the notebooks and photographs was sent to my bar in Kyobashi about 10 years ago. The sender's name wasn't on it, but it must have been Yozo. There was no return address. The package miraculously survived the air raids. I read the notebooks for the first time the other day. Did you cry? No, not exactly. It's so sad. When a person becomes like that, there's no hope. 10 years. He's probably dead. He must have sent them as a gesture of gratitude. He might have exaggerated some things, but it seems you were quite badly hurt. If it's all true, and if I had been his friend, I might have had him committed too. It was his father's fault, she said casually. The Yozo we knew was a kind, thoughtful young man. If only he hadn't drunk so much. No, even if he drank. He was a good person, like a saint.